Well, wow! I was actually recording last night. I did an episode of Our Lives in Horror with Justin Park.
Oh, lovely! Justin's great.
Great! Oh my God, we discovered we have a lot of overlap.
Oh, interesting.
Awful amounts of overlap in terms of influence. Barker was a big one.
Yeah,
was a very big one for him. It was Cabal.
Oh right, okay, yeah.
That was his first Barker, and it was the book that kind of inspired him to write in the same way that for me it was Weave World. So we had a lot to talk about. We had a lot to talk about. It was great fun.
What's the short version of what Cabal's about? As someone who hasn't read it.
The short version is about a species of monsters who live in a graveyard realm called Midian, and they are sort of counterposed to the forces of order and society. It's basically an inversion of a standard horror story. So the monsters are the good guys, and the forces of humanity and civilization and order are forces of oppression, effectively, and violence and negativity. It's very good. It's very
like
good.
like the real world then.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, it's
sounds really escapist. Lovely.
No. It's definitely one of the more realist of Barker's works, despite the monsters. Made into a flawed but interesting film in the form of Nightbreed.
Oh, I have heard of Nightbreed and maybe seen it like way back, I guess.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Nightbreed. It's flawed, but it is very compelling.
Yeah, it sounds worth rewatching actually, or just going straight to the source material, perhaps.
Well, it's got this sort of like guerrilla filmmaking quality to it, despite the fact that Barker could command quite a lot of money at that point. With the success of Hellraiser, it feels like he's still making a kind of grungy, independent film.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know I've read Cabal, but I can't remember anything about it. Weirdly, it's one of the few Barker's dodge too clearly for me for some reason.
It's an interesting one. It's much closer to the Books of Blood than most of the stuff that we've discussed, I think. But you're starting to see glimmers of that sort of wider mythological concern that he starts to develop a little later on.
Yeah, sure. Oh, well, I look forward to hearing that anyway. That sounds like a good conversation. I'm glad you got to catch up with Justin because he's.
It was brilliant. I mean, I met him at Lex's party, and that was great fun. But we were both exhausted for different reasons, So we chatted a lot, but it was kind of like passing,
Yeah.
So this was fantastic. This was really good fun. We managed to get like 3 hours out of it, so it went well.
Yeah. It's very strange. There are a few occasions when I've recorded something 2 nights in a row. I guess that happens to you quite a bit more, George, just giving your output. But
it's starting to. Yeah, it's really starting to now.
Yeah. It's a weird headspace because especially if the first one went well and you're like, oh, okay. Thin ice here. That's the way I feel about it anyway.
It was wonderful. It really was. I mean, we found we have loads of influences in common, really niche, weird little things like the Ladybird horror books and stuff like that,
Okay.
Yeah, that was, I mean, Harryhausen, Harryhausen films was a big one.
Right.
It was brilliant. I mean, we almost had to stop because we started talking about Poltergeist, since
right. You just recorded on that recently.
Well, Justin wanted to pull me up because he's like, why didn't you talk about Poltergeist 3? Why does no one ever talk about Poltergeist 3?
Interesting.
I was like, let me stop because we are going to.
Right,
that was always, I promise that was always the plan.
Yeah,
we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about Poltergeist 3 and the remake in the next video.
Oh, that'd be fascinating because I know nothing about 3 or the remake really.
3 is really interesting. I rewatched it for the purposes of the podcast, and it's definitely the most flawed of the original films. There's no doubt about that. But it's actually not bad. It's trying to do something. It's not just sort of like a heartless cash-in horror movie sequel to a popular franchise. It's trying. It doesn't always succeed. In fact, it often doesn't succeed. But there are glimmers of interesting things there. I quite liked it this time round, I've got to say. For all of its flaws, I had a good old time with it. The remake, on the other hand, I had to turn off. Honestly.
Oh, that's a bad one.
Yeah, like really bad. Phenomenally bad. It's one of those remakes that's insulting to the original source material. You know, it so profoundly doesn't understand what makes the original charming. And it does that. It does exactly what Jack said in our conversation, because he's seen it but can't remember a damn thing about it. And I was the same until I came to rewatch it. But it does exactly what he said it would do, which is it introduces all of these synthetic tensions, you know?
Right.
Whereas in the original film, the Freeling family are all incredibly charming and they're simpatico. They work as a family unit, you know? They're all quirky and fun and idiosyncratic. In this film, they're all archetypes and they've all got this sort of like synthetic tension to them. So, you know, Carol Ann can't just be like a slightly quirky, fun, interesting little girl. No, she has to be basically an alien.
Okay.
Right.
You know? The worst one is by far the eldest daughter. In the original film, she's hilarious. She's absolutely hilarious. In this one, it's like she's been written by a Reddit-dwelling incel. She's a teenage girl, therefore she is evil.
It's a very strange decision in storytelling. It's something, I mean, you know, you made me think about, and obviously I listened to the show that you did with Jack, so I've sort of heard you talking about it there, but it really did make me think, like, it's a very interesting decision in storytelling where we seem to have got to this point, certainly for a certain kind of movie where, you know, as you say, it's not enough to have this horrific situation. Everything bundled up in it has got to contain, like, huge amounts of inherent tension and drama and problems and spikiness before you even begin. It does seem, I don't know, it feels like a trend that's come in at some point. And I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I'm not quite sure where that comes from. But I was thinking about it because I don't know if either of you have seen it. I finished watching The Last of Us this week. Finally caught the final episode. And no spoilers. But one of the interesting things about that is I played the game about halfway through the show. I suddenly remembered I had the game, and I thought, oh, maybe I should play this. I'll install it and see what it's like. And that was the evening gone. But there are storytelling decisions that they make in the show that they don't make in the game, and some of them obviously are about the fact that it's a game, and game narratives do have to work differently, obviously. But what I find really interesting is how often the show, again, no spoilers, but the show will often choose a more humanized or humane portrayal of the characters, a less rough, a less harsh portrayal of the characters than the game does. And weirdly, because of that, the show for me packed a far bigger kind of emotional punch than the game. I mean, I love the game too, and again, as I say, some of the decisions they made for the story in the game make sense for the game and wouldn't have made sense for the show. So this is not necessarily a quality issue as such, but it is interesting to me that where the game tends to go very, very harsh and just kind of like aggressively ambiguous on the characters a lot of the time, if you see what I mean. That kind of like determination to have them be really spiky, where the show makes them more emotionally rounded and more emotionally sympathetic. It actually makes the story weirdly a lot tougher, I think. So
I would agree. And you've got the same situation happening here because in the original film of Poltergeist, you invest in the Freeling family because you like them, because they're so well drawn, and you invest in their family unit too because it is so cohesive. In the remake, you just don't care. Right. They're annoying. The characters are annoying. Yeah. There's a sort of fingers on a chalkboard quality to them, and they're all, because of the friction between them, that tension comes off the screen and it translates to you as the viewer, which can work. I mean, don't get me wrong, that can work as a piece of frisson if it's intentional, but it's not. It's synthetic and it feels repellent. There are sequences where they're all talking at one another or over one another, and you've got the teenage daughter, because she's a teenage girl, therefore she is the bitch archetype, as written by an incel, and she's just like shrieking at everyone and being unpleasant for no reason. You've got the little alien version of Carol Ann just being alien and weird. It's
a tricky topic, that, isn't it? Because you don't want to come across as some sort of not exactly puritanical, but like kind of like saying that horror should not happen to flawed characters. You know what I mean? Like flawed units. Because I was thinking, it's funny you mentioned remakes. I was just quite relatively recent, I think about 6 months ago or less, I watched the Evil Dead remake from the early 2010s.
Oh yes,
and in that it's a less happy bunch of youths that the stuff happens to, including the protagonist who has like a real serious problem and is like dealing with it and is only in the cabin because she's dealing with it. And I don't think that was inherently a bad way to go, although I don't think they do. Well, they do quite a lot with it. I'm not sure if they really tackle it head on, really. But I don't know, because like go back to Poltergeist, like the family in that, they're like happy, broadly happy and functional, but they're not like boring, are they?
No, that's it. Right, that's the trick, isn't it? They're actually really fascinating. They're really fun and they're really interesting. The intrigue of them is the fact that they are charming. They're not repellent, when that is a real, it does seem to be a real problem with a lot of sort of popular horror cinema in particular. It seems to have this problem whereby, well, if there are characters in a horror movie situation, then they not only have to have tensions, they have to be awful.
And it's interesting, right? I mean, there is a thing about horror. I can't remember why I was thinking about this today, but I got on the track of thinking about there is sometimes a great pleasure to be had, certainly as a writer, I'd hope as an audience as well, of having something really unpleasant happen to a horrible person. Actually, like that can be really enjoyable.
Definitely.
I mean, it's an interesting thing about like it's not, but I think there's something about. I think for me, it's about, as a writer, whatever your decision about your protagonist, whether they're unpleasant people or not. It's a conscious decision, and you understand the impact it's going to have on the narrative that you're trying to tell, and the way it's going to feel to the audience. I think there's something kind of. I mean, I always think about Hellraiser. I love how that final scene, as much as it is absolute gross out when you see Frank's kind of final, and it is like stomach churning, that effect. There is also a bit of you that's like, yeah, but you're a fucker, you deserve, you know what I mean? Like,
so deserve this, right?
Very differently to how you'd feel if it was Kirsty in that shot at the end.
Well, he seems that's deepened by the fact he seems to feel somewhat ambiguous about it as well.
True, absolutely,
himself. His lips.
In extremis, he seems to actually rather enjoy it, doesn't he? So
getting something out of it, put it that way.
But I think you hit the nail on the head there, Kit, when you said it's about intentionality, isn't it? So like the thing with the Poltergeist remake is the film actually doesn't intend for you to dislike these characters. It wants you to sympathize with them. It wants to say, oh, look, this is a normal family, and look, they hate one another. They're like, just like you, right? And it just doesn't work. It wants you to sympathize with them, and it just does not work. Added on to that, you have the problem that it does nothing with the source material. Now, this came out in 2015, much later than I thought it did, right? The film itself is bizarrely anachronistic. It has the feeling of a horror film made in about 2005. It has that quality about it, that very particular slew of remakes that came out in the early 2000s. Stylistically, it looks like one of those, but also structurally, because all it does, it's like someone's seen Poltergeist, or even like a rundown of Poltergeist and said, all right, this image is in it, so we've got to put that in there. Let's put that in there somewhere, not understanding the context or why it's in there or why it works in the original Poltergeist, So there's a clown doll. Let's put the clown doll in there. Why not? There's a bit with a tree. Let's put the tree in there. Why not? It just, they come through the TV. So we'll do the TV thing, but we won't do it with any grace or charm. It's that. It's recreating what was in the original film, but not understanding the context. Now, 2015, streaming services were available then. You could have done so much with the concept of ghosts that come through technology, audio visual technology, video games, streaming services, anything like that. You could have reinvented the mythology to make it relevant to the time in which it was created. But no, it's an odd beast that doesn't seem to want to be or do anything. It just wants to be a remake.
I think the idea of like remakes and how they're in dialogue with their original is interesting and can be done really artfully and really artlessly. And I think the line's probably quite thin. Like when you were talking about that, I was thinking a bit about the Candyman film in recent years. Because that was I really like that, but not everyone liked that. But I think most people recognise that it was trying to do something quite clever and delicate with interacting with the original film. And I think that's probably I don't really want that to become cliche either. You know what I mean? I don't really want that to become the thing that everyone does. Like, I think it's all right to make a straight remake, whatever that means.
Yes, it can work. It can be done. It really, really can. But this is neither one thing nor to other. You know, it doesn't. It doesn't know what it wants to be, because really, when you really, in like the grimmest honesty imaginable, it is just something that was decided around a boardroom. Someone somewhere said, "Oh, we've got this franchise. It's got an established audience. Let's just remake it, and people will watch it. People will go to the cinema or buy the DVD to watch it." You know,
because I think, I mean, the two sort of, I mean, relatively recent horror remakes that I think worked pretty well were both Romero movies. The remake of Dawn of the Dead, the Snyder movie, I thought was perfectly serviceable. It was different enough. But again, it was that thing about like that I think that probably was a quote unquote straight remake in a sense. I don't think it was, you know, it wasn't super referencing the original movie, but it was basically the same scenario, and it was just, you know, but clearly, you know, I mean, I'm not actually a huge fan of Snyder as a whole, but he clearly had a passion for what he was trying to do there. Yeah. And I thought that worked pretty well. And the other one was The Crazies, which I think was a really super solid remake. And just trying to do something slightly tonally different with the subject matter. I think the original Crazies is so dark. Like, it really is. Like, I mean, Romero was, I think people forget about that with Romero, because they remember the zombie stuff. They forget like some of the stuff in the Crazies, and like Martin, like that guy went really, really dark sometimes, you know, like super dark. And very much the remake does feel like it. I mean, it's not PG-13, but it's definitely like 15 rather than 18 certificate version of the story, but it's still great fun. Like, it's a really fun movie, you know. So I mean, don't get me wrong, remakes are hard. Remakes are always going to be phenomenally difficult, and you are putting yourself between a rock and a hard place. You know, you are going to displease people regardless of what you do. But this is not just a bad remake, it's a bad film. Right. You know, just on the level of being a film, it's bad. It's all over the place. It's tonally inconsistent. The characters are charmless. The script is bizarre at times. Like, not in a good way either, as in, like, human beings don't act like this. Even characters in horror films don't act like this, you know? And the set pieces just don't make the ones, you know, the wonderful, ridiculous, like almost absurdist set pieces from the original Poltergeist, which is so much fun, just don't have any enthusiasm. They don't have any passion behind them. You know, one of the things I said to Jack when we were talking about the original is you get the impression with the original that people were like, "Oh, this is a great idea. Let's put this in there." And people were like, "Yeah, we can do that. Let's do it. Yeah." And everyone involved, you know, was like, "Yeah, let's do this. This is fun. This is going to be great." And as a result, that enthusiasm comes off the screen. You feel that enthusiasm as the audience member, but this feels flat. It just feels like it can't really be bothered. It doesn't feel passionate. It just feels like it wanted to give you like a watered down version of the images from the original Poltergeist, but all filtered through a blue lens, so they're all washed of color and life and vivacity. I couldn't finish it. It's rare that I won't finish a film once started, you know?
I'll probably love it.
Yeah, you probably will.
Again, not deliberately, not to annoy you. It'll just have that nice bonus.
You just do what you did to me on the Lost Boys and go like, "Yeah, that was fun. What's wrong with
that?" Well, listen.
Shall we not start that one again?
That's fair.
I mean, Kit, you must have had that conversation so many times at this point.
Oh yes, I have had it enough times, and I will continue to have it every single convention I go to for the rest of my life. And I've just accepted that. It's just
no doubt. And any sort of Facebook post which involves the Lost Boys, right?
Yeah. Any notable anniversary, anything happens with any past,
inevitable remake, obviously.
Yeah. You know, you say that as a joke, but it is inevitable. It'll happen.
That'll definitely happen.
It'll happen.
My
God, it'll happen. And who knows? Maybe in this instance, the remake might be good, right?
There couldn't be much fucking worse. Anyway,
Kit will love that. Kit will love that, and everyone else will hate it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, maybe that's it. That'll be the
shit, and everyone else.
Oh, that'd be brilliant, wouldn't it? God, I want it to happen now. I want to see the editorial. I want to see the article and the rage that results, the utter rage that results. But no, I mean, the one we're here to discuss tonight, the menu. Whoa, what a piece, eh? What a film. No. It was, I mean, for me, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I didn't even know it existed until some friends of mine just said, have you seen this? And I said, no. And they said, right, do not go on the internet. Do not look it up. Do not read anything about it. Go and watch it the minute you get home from our place, which I did. And wow.
Yeah.
What a piece of work.
No, I had a similar thing. I saw the poster appear in a few people's Facebook feeds.
Mm-hmm.
And underneath people, I mean, I think pretty uniformly positive response from the people in the horror community that I follow that saw it. But the funny part was I'd kind of clocked it, and sometimes my missus has to be persuaded when it comes to horror. She's pretty all right with crime, but horror can be a bit of a dicey proposition. Yeah. But what was hilarious was I was trying to figure out how to get around to saying, hey, do you want to maybe check this out? And somehow it made it onto her list completely independently.
I can sort of understand that, though, because I know it's one of the things I have noticed in retrospect is that, like, people are having difficulty classifying what this film is. Yeah. You know, you'll find it's a horror, comedy, mystery, drama kind of thing. That's exactly what it is. It's this wonderful idiosyncratic piece of work. I mean, I don't know why when I came to sit down and watch it, I had a feeling certainly early on that it was going to be kind of like Knives Out or Glass Onion, because it's a very similar setup, right?
It's really weird that it came out at the same autumn as Glass Onion.
Right,
it is,
right.
That's quite odd.
Because it's like the setup is very similar, and also the themes are very, very, very similar indeed.
Yeah, it's not so much odd that they both came out in this sort of zeitgeist that seems to be emerging or whatever. It's just it's more that they were both kind of quite big hits. Like sort of, Glass Onion more so in terms of the cultural conversation, I think. But yeah, you know.
Oh, I think these two films are definitely tapping into something. They're tapping into a profound and not always sublimated these days dissatisfaction and frustration with the strata of our society, right? But I think, I mean, where Glass Onion, despite the fact that Glass Onion goes right for the throat, it is just like absolutely, we are going to talk about the 1% and how fucking awful they all are. That's what we're going to do. This, I found that the menu is a little bit more successful in terms of its critique, I suppose, simply because it's tonally so different from Glass Onion is ultimately a comedy. You know, at the end, it's ultimately a comedy, and as a result, it's no matter how trenchant its observations are, it does have that slight softness. It has the laughter to carry it along. This is a mite more disturbing, I found.
I mean, I think this is straight up comedy horror, and I think it's both. And I think that already puts it in fairly rarefied company. There actually aren't that many movies that manage to pull off, or I think narratives in general that manage to pull off equal parts comedy and horror. I think it's incredibly hard to do.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the two genres are closely related, are twins in some ways, are two sides of the same coin often. I mean, we talked about this ad nauseum, really, set up, payoff, set up, punchline. And there's, I always think about the Mel Brooks quote, comedy is, tragedy is when I stub my toe, comedy is when you fall down a manhole and die, right? Positionality is everything. But I think what I find fascinating, I mean, I wasn't able to fully rewatch it before we recorded, unfortunately, but I did rewatch the first half an hour earlier today, and I was struck by how careful and how formal the setup within the movie is. It mirrors, structurally, the movie mirrors what's going on in the restaurant. Exactly. And it's really impressive. And I think for me, I think the reason it packs the punch that it does, and I appreciate it doesn't feel this way necessarily for everyone. It doesn't land this strongly for everyone, but for me it's precisely because it's exactly equal parts comedy and horror. Yeah. And it's kind of both at the same time. I mean, the moment that I thought of that illustrates this best is the is the dish, the fourth dish, where the sous chef. Oh, spoilers for this entire movie.
Yeah,
but
for the entire thing.
massive
By the
I
way,
want to
guys,
talk about. I want to
go
talk
and
about
watch
the
it,
end
please.
in some
Yeah.
detail. So,
yeah.
So the scene in the fourth dish where the sous chef shoots himself in the head.
Yeah.
Because it's similar. That is absolutely a punchline moment, and my reaction in the moment was absolutely to both laugh and gasp in horror, kind of at the same time.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is in. Well, I think all the elements are working together. It's in the writing, obviously. It's obviously in the performance. I have to shout out as well in that particular scene. The editing is absolutely exquisite. The way it cuts between views, so you see the way the curtains come shooting across.
Yeah.
Just before he pulls the trigger, absolutely extraordinary.
Just technically alone, this film is incredible. I mean, it's an exercise in. Ironically, what it's doing, it's that thing where it's echoing the culture that it's talking about, right? It's echoing the artistry that it's talking about. It is exquisite in the same way that the dishes are, right? It's just poised and beautiful, and every single thing is considered. And as you say, it all has poetry. When you rewatch the film, I think you notice this more actually. The way that the first half mirrors the second half to a certain degree, very, very beautiful. I mean, really starkly clever.
I think it's so succinct as well because there are so many diners in the restaurant, whenever it goes around the room and kind of gives you a little taste of each table, and what the conversation is. Sometimes it's just 3 lines,
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you get to understand who these characters are through that, without really much in the way of exposition, is phenomenally brilliant. I love that. I love that in any medium, but I think it's particularly acute in cinema when you can introduce characters in that way, where they aren't sat around sort of saying, I am this person and I'm doing this. You get to know them naturally through their conversation, through their dialogue. It's utterly brilliant.
I think that's really important. The other thing I think that builds on that adds so much to the atmosphere of the movie is the way it feels as though it's taking place in real time. It isn't quite, because it was a 4.5 hour meal and it's only actually an hour and 40. I think it's it is a very
tight,
concise movie. Yeah, very, very tight movie. But one of the ways it pulls that trick is that you will start the conversation on one table and the camera will pan away and you will still hear the conversation happening in the background, but your focus is now on the new table. So you get a feeling like this whole thing is happening in real time. And one of the impact that had on me as a viewer is that you almost feel like you are in the restaurant. Maybe you're one of the wait staff. You're kind of moving between the tables almost.
Yeah.
Following the conversation. It's extraordinary.
It's that Hitchcockian principle, isn't it, of the audience being a voyeur. That's what it makes you. It makes you a voyeur, and therefore it makes you almost complicit to a certain degree. And it's a way of pointing the finger in a way, in the way that the whole film is. And the chef makes this explicit at one point. All of you are responsible for this culture that we've created. Everyone is responsible for this heaping pile of shit that we call art, which can only be accessed by the worst people on earth, the richest people, who will never appreciate it anyway. I think one of the things that makes the film uncomfortable is that subtext, because it's one of those wonderful films that actually draws the audience into its own conspiracy and slightly points the finger at them. It says, you're part of this too.
Well, I think the whole film walks a really delicate line, and I definitely think we'll come back to this a few times, of a sort of snobbery back into reverse snobbery, back through into something that's kind of probably a blend of both. And I'm thinking like partly in terms of Ralph Fiennes' chef character. I think it's more voiced through him, but there's stuff going on. And it's one of the reasons him and Anya Taylor-Joy's character are such a great antagonistic, mostly pairing, because they've both got, very heartfelt, slightly cracked opinions of what people should appreciate and what they shouldn't,
Absolutely, yeah. It's actually kind of brilliant in that regard. It's one of those wonderful films that will not let itself get away with sort of pat answers. At no point do you feel absolute sympathy, really, for anyone in the film. I mean, okay, Margot is kind of like the protagonist in many respects. She is the character she's the audience proxy. But even she is flawed, She's not entirely an innocent, as it were, who's just thrown into this place.
And I just want to pick up on something David said, because I think it's a really key observation. I was thinking as you were talking there about the scene where it's quite early on where Tyler is explaining to Margot, or trying to explain to Margot, I mean maybe mansplain, but to Margot about his philosophy around this whole thing. And he delivers this incredible speech about how some people make art, some people do painting, some people play musical instruments, and that's all bullshit, because this is the real deal. This is life and death. This is the elements of life itself, the elements of death itself. This is creation. And he delivers this whole really impassioned speech. And it's interesting because Tyler on the whole is fairly gross from the beginning. He's actually not a terribly likable person. I mean, the very first thing he says is he orders Margot to stop smoking because it's going to ruin her palate. There's control, there's ickiness. We find out very early on he's paid for her ticket. And it's, so the whole thing is like, obviously there's a power imbalance in the relationship, and obviously our sympathies between the two of them lie, I think, rightly with Margot, even at that point. But it's interesting how in that moment, Tyler's delivery is so good, and the actor, I mean, is it Nicholas Hoult, does such a good job with that speech, that actually when Margot says, wow, I actually think maybe I do kind of get this a bit. I don't know, I'm kind of with him in the moment. I really am. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, David, the way the movie switches between this is art and this is completely preposterously pretentious bullshit. But it keeps going for quite a long time, actually, between those 2 points. I mean, I think about the opening of Dish 3 and the tacos and the speech that the chef gives about stabbing his father in the thigh with a pair of scissors. And at that moment, the scissors go into the chicken thighs that are being served up. And it's like, I actually have no fucking idea what's going. I mean, that's a great moment, because that's still early enough. That it's like, I actually have no fucking idea what this movie is going to be. And I think, I don't know about you two, but I kind of naively assumed, I think the cliche probably would have been, I assumed that this was going to be some kind of Hannibal riff, actually. I assumed that it was going to be, they were going to be serving up long pig, basically. And it's so much more interesting than that.
It sidesteps the most obvious thing you could do with a sinister film called The Menu, showing a sinister chef.
Definitely. Definitely, it makes it so much more abstract than that, doesn't it? And so much more interesting. I mean, it's at once this exercise in the most profound egotism and narcissism, and yet at the same time, it is this really excoriating attack upon this entire culture to which the man has dedicated his entire existence, and which he has come to the conclusion is ultimately a farce. Right? It's artifice. It's nothing but egotism and contrivance. It's utterly brilliant in that regard.
I don't want to let Hannibal quite escape our notice, although again I think that's something we could return to. I think particularly Kate, you said you want to talk about the ending more. I've got something specific to say relating to Hannibal and that, but I mentioned to Kit in messages last week that it's interesting that, because Ralph Fiennes is one of 3 versions of the Red Dragon that have been put on screen.
That's right. 3 at the moment.
So I think his presence here, well, for me, it conjures a little bit of that intensity up. In fact, those various speeches you were referencing, some of them, Kit, where he's talking about, he's introducing the meals, the like nice little monologues that he gets. That is also about skewering the way artists talk about their work, not necessarily about, obviously we don't usually hear from the chefs in the restaurant unless you're at that kind of end of the dining experience, but the way artists are, primed to talk about their work in interviews and exhibitions and stuff like that. But it's also not a few millimeters away from "Do you see?" Is it? It's he's showing a presentation.
Sure.
Yeah, it's wonderful as well. I mean, Ralph Fiennes is the perfect actor to play that part, because he always has this rather sinister quiescence about him, where you get the impression that he could explode at any moment into full-blown psychopathy, which he interestingly never really does in this film.
No, it's great. He goes like, the worst you get from him is when he gets very cold and very still. There's the confrontation early with Margot about the bread dish, where she just refuses to. And I love that, by the way. That's a really strong early signifier of where Margot's place in the story is. Because she's ultimately going to be actually her ultimate kind of role is neither neither patron nor server. That's the whole point. She finds another way. She shatters the paradigm. But she actually, you know, again, you talked about how the film mirrors itself, the front half and the back half. That's the front half where she shatters the paradigm in the second dish, where she just says, I'm not eating this shit.
Yeah.
These are dips without bread. And she doesn't do what the rich, you know, what the trust fund wankers do, which is demand bread and then get pissy. She doesn't do that.
No.
But she just says, I'm not eating it. I'm not doing it. Because that's not food. It's a fucking dip. And I'm not, you know.
It's interesting because it works on a meta level as well. What her character is doing is demonstrating her status within the story, which is, ironically, she's not part of it. And the chef tells her this. Obviously, he tells her this. And of course, it's frustrating to him because it's throwing off this entire narrative, this art that he's spun from food and people and circumstances. She is not supposed to be there.
But that's where the center of it comes to me, because this whole thing is about control. And I remember reading, this is a few years ago now in The Guardian, there was this thing, it was pre-pandemic, but there was this thing about these weird kind of underground pop-up foodie restaurant things that were happening in London, and they find some abandoned area that they could get for a day, or, you know, get the kitchens in, and it would be a thing where, like, you know, you go in and you just got what you were given. They just served. You didn't even get a menu, so you didn't know what you were eating. They just served up, and it was some insane Michelin-starred chef dude in the kitchen who was, you know, but wanted to do this weird experimental thing. And at the end, you paid what you wanted. You just paid, you know, whatever. But the thing I remember, the detail I remember reading in this article, and again, this is going back, it's maybe 2017, something like that. They actually handcuffed the guests to the table before you start eating. And the waiter, apparently, according to the reporter, the waiter then leaned in and said, good food is all about control. So that was in my mind the whole way through this. Because, of course, you know, that confrontation is so telling, because the chef's whole line is like, you're not going to get full because I've balanced this out carefully. I have worked this out. No one's going to get full tonight. I know what I'm doing. But, you know, so you can eat. But Margot's clincher is, I decide what I put in my body.
That's it, exactly right. That's it. You've got this sort of this incredible clash of power dynamics going on here. And as a result of that clash, you have a commentary on a wider commentary on the power dynamic between, like, guests and chefs, people who run the restaurants, and wider still. Yeah. Consumers and art, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's telling about that moment is that's the moment when Tyler suddenly gets really pissed off with her.
Yeah.
Tyler is humiliated by that because he's worshipping at the altar of this whole thing. I mean, at that point, we don't know how much, right? We don't realize how badly he's bought into it, but we already know he's a fanatic, basically. And Tyler's response to that is to call her a fucking child. Like, he's embarrassed by her just asserting bodily autonomy. Now, that's that's telling as fuck, right? That's really that's an incredibly.
I mean, it's a narcissist's response, right? It's a narcissist's response. You're not playing the game. You're not doing what my world requires you to do, what my narratives require you to do. Therefore, you're evil.
Well,
you're wrong.
It's interesting, actually, because we were talking before about control, and, you know, the control that the chef exerts over that room. You know, literally the claps that herald his announcements. You know, the thunderclaps. It's after the breadless bread plate, including the split emulsion, where Margot turns to, is it Tyler, Nicholas Holt's character, turns to Tyler and sort of says, you know, with some sort of disgust, but kind of a form of wonder as well. I think I wrote it down, she says, you like this? He's basically insulting you. Yeah. And shortly after that, Elsa, the sort of sous chef, would you say? Her character, I want to talk about her as well. She whispers in that guy, you know, one of the tech bros' ears, she whispers, you'll eat less than you desire and more than you deserve. And I was just thinking, well, Tyler, you know, he's basically hired two sex workers of sort for this evening, hasn't he? He's hired he's hired Margot, but he's also hired the chef. You know, like he's hired I don't know what the male form of dominatrix is, but he's hired that. He's hired that. He's hired someone to be rude to him. Really, they all have.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, there's almost like a sub quality to Tyler in that regard, right?
Definitely to him. Yeah, I'm not
he
sure
wants the domination. You know, he wants the domination. He wants to worship at the altar, and he never breaks that. You know, that is actually, and it's sincere as well. I mean, this is something obviously that he profoundly feels. I mean, right up until his inevitable end, right?
Well, right up until whatever Ralph Fiennes whispers in his ear.
Yeah, and I love the fact you never find out. Right, that's brilliant. What is it that breaks Tyler's spirit.
It's
What
the
is
opposite
it
of whatever Bill Murray whispered in Scarlett Johansson's ear. It's lost. Whatever that is, we know it's the opposite.
No, it's an absolutely wonderful moment, and I think Tyler's a fascinating character actually, because he's kind of he is absolutely awful, and he's absolutely wretched as well. And I mean, and the movie doesn't stint on either of those. But as I say, he has just enough of those moments, especially early on, where that kind of fanaticism, it does feel oddly touching.
Well, I think it's the sincerity more than anything, because he is not playing a part here. This is not a mask that he's wearing. This is true.
Yeah.
He's actually, and of course we find out later, enormous spoilers again, that he knows that everyone's going to die here tonight. That is part of the artistry at work here. So he has happily sold himself to be part of this creation.
Yeah.
There's a certain poetry. Okay, it's insane, but it's a poetry nonetheless, and there is something about that that's kind of endearing.
Well, I like that there's a fine line, and they play with it, especially in that, say, first hour, I'd say, between, again, we're doing spoilers up front, so by the end of the film, whatever else he is, he's hired an escort, and he's B, much, much worse, obviously, is that he doesn't care whether she lives or dies. That's a different magnitude of awful.
The only reason she's there is to make up the numbers, right? Because Chef doesn't serve.
He can't get a table by his own, yeah.
Of course, yeah. But what I like about the earlier parts of that character and Margot and Tyler's, quote unquote date, is some of the bits, as you say, there's an off vibe about them from the start, but some of it is, in most relationships, you'll have been on a date that the other person was more into.
Yeah,
you'll have gone out on a limb for them. You'll maybe after a year or a month or whatever, they'll be like, "Hey, there's this thing, and I know you're not that into it, but do you want to give it a go?" And those often don't go well. they sometimes do, and sometimes they lead to shared passions and discoveries of shared passions. But there's a nice, even though from the very start you think like this isn't going to be one of those ones that goes well, but and boy were you right there. But
they rarely go this badly.
yeah. But I like that though, because there is a in the healthiest of relationships, or at least relationships that have the chance to be healthy and equal power footing, etc. There'll be moments really when you're basically, hopefully politely and with consent, getting your partner to do something that you're more into than them. And trying to explain it even.
Yeah.
Well, you're trying to share a passion, aren't you? Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting. And I mean, there's little bits of misdirection early on as well, where he's capable of being quite solicitous towards her and quite kind of caring. Oh, I'm when she, when they give the wrong name of the guest, and there's that moment where Elsa, who's the maitre d', by the way, it's her role, when she greets them on the island, she actually, there's that very weird moment where she gives the wrong name, looks and says to Margot, well, we'll try and make your stay here as whatever it is, comfortable or pleasurable as possible. I can't remember which it is. And straight away, Tyler's like, "I'm really, really sorry. That was really embarrassing. I apologize." And he seems genuine in that moment. Like, so, but it's interesting. Like, for me, that what that underlines, given what happens later, is there's a kind of sociopathy of manners about. I mean, that's about the whole thing. It lays across the whole thing, because obviously they're all doing that. The chef as well as the guests. But I think it's a really interesting early indication of what's going on. I'm also reminded of the moment later on where they go, Tyler immediately leaps over and does it, when they're invited to go and look at the chefs making the food. And he does that whole thing about like, oh, you're using this, this gadget which does this thing and that thing. Oh, yeah, I've got one of them, and then the guy says yes. And he names him. He says Tyler or whatever. And he goes back to Sharon. He's like, "He knew my name. Fucking hell! Do you think Chef knows my name? What's going on?" And Margot's like, "You didn't ask for his name."
Yeah,
right.
That's such a great moment, especially because later on, Margot's very much the one who's sort of, breaking down that paradigm and being a pain in the arse on that particular subject.
Isn't it fascinating? I mean, she is basically the atheist at the table, right? She's the atheist at the table of the true believer. That's the communication you've got going on here. The one who is made so that they cannot believe.
I mean, I feel like she's an agnostic rather than an atheist, actually. But yeah, I mean, I take your point.
I think I think one of the reasons the movie's so resonant and kind of successfully creepy and so immersive, perhaps we talked about that before, is that we've all, let's just stick to restaurants for simplicity. We've all been served in restaurants, however frequently, or infrequently, but we've all I've worked in food preparation as well and in kitchens, and it's and most people have worked in some form of service industry, I'd say.
Yeah.
So we both know how that can be okay from either side, or it can be great. It can be great actually on both sides, but it's more often just all right at best.
Yeah.
and it's often appalling. It's awful and twisted and perverse and depressing. And I can include being served in that as well as serving. Like if you're in the wrong mood, you're in a bad mood and grumpy, and you go to a restaurant and you're not in the mood for it. The fact of being waited on can seem kind of irritating, even though you're paying for it and you've turned up for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you are in a place you don't want to be. You are having people interrupt you in a way that you don't want to be interrupted. There's a sort of intimacy to the exchange, isn't there? Which maybe you don't want at that particular moment because your mind is elsewhere or because you've got other concerns. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's because it's not a very natural thing, or the impulse to help and serve someone you love is a natural thing, but the impulse to pay for it and be paid for it.
Well, that's it as well, isn't it? I mean,
depends how you define natural, obviously, but like it's a different thing. Should we say?
I think it's something the film actually contains, which is a wider commentary upon the whole assumptions and dynamic of the restaurant culture, which is where you have these bizarre master-slave relationships that are totally insincere, right? Completely insincere, and can be overturned in an instant, which, of course, is exactly what happens here. Completely overturned. The power dynamic can be undone with the snap of a finger. And of course, I mean, it's another. I don't know whether it actually comes up, whether Chef actually says it in the film, but these people could save themselves, right? They could get up and resist the narrative that's being imposed upon them. They could rush the lot of them and undo it completely.
Well, what he doesn't say, but I think is maybe hovering in that moment, is if they work together.
Yeah, exactly.
If they work together, that's it. And they never will, because they're people who have never worked together. These are people who live in ivory towers, right? They live in their own little gilded cells, and that's it. They've never had to work with anyone else.
Something I think this is, I've made a little note of the sort of course stages, and I think this comes after the palate cleanser that is the bergamot tea from my notes. But I've got written down in block capitals. It's funny, just before we get away from the sort of abusive, sort of passive aggressive form of like service and what, how restaurants can treat you. I've just got down in block capitals written, I think this is when the chef's going around sort of talking about the perceived flaws of all the guests as he sees them, why they're there in that sense. And I've just written down in block capitals, this is a roast.
Nice. Yes.
Not going for the pun, but I was like, this is he's brought them here for a roast.
Yeah, surely given what ultimately happens to the characters, surely an elaborate pun in and of itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's also the rich and powerful being, because what a roast often is, especially in the televised form, is the rich and powerful being brought somewhere where you can, again, the court jester can operate, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, of course, these conversations about service actually and very explicitly come up when Chef is talking to Margot, right? When he's having his private moments with Margot, and they actually do become honest with one another. That's when it comes up, right? He even asks her, in her job as an escort, do you enjoy it? Yeah. And she's really honest. She says sometimes, yeah.
I think she says she used to, doesn't she?
Which
is exactly right. where he is with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely important, because I think Margot is a kind of code breaker. Like she functions on both sides of the divide at the same time, and actually she's neither. She's a third thing. The other moment I think that's really significant for that is where is in that scene where Tyler finally snaps and calls her a child. And she looks him dead in the eye and says, "You need to apologize."
Yeah.
And that's one of those moments where it's like she is clearly, I mean, she's an escort, but she at the same time she is establishing boundaries. Like she has very clear boundaries that she won't let anyone, whether it's the chef or Tyler, she won't let them cross.
Yeah.
And of course that puts her completely outside of the paradigm of everybody else, because everyone else is either in the service or being served paradigm. They're all acting acting as those parts, and they're all very accustomed to it. But she's the one who's the code breaker. And I love how in that scene you're talking about, I love how the chef treats her with complete respect as a fellow server. I love how that whole conversation is implicitly kind of sex worker positive, right? Just by the fact that he's just not remote. He just says, no, we're in the same business, basically.
That's right.
In those terms, but it's like he says, what's the line? Like, I've had good customers and bad customers or something like that. Like, and I know
what a bad customer is like.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Exactly. And I think that's, I love that bit. I really love, and that whole scene, actually, that whole conversation, I think it's just a really fantastic bit of cinema. But ultimately, he's still the guy exerting control. Mm-hmm. He still denies her agency because he says, which side are you going to be on? But when she doesn't pick, he picks for her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, they're both identified as being, well, they're both mysterious, right, aren't they? And I think they both become a little less mysterious. Interestingly, I think Margot remains the far more mysterious character by the end of the film, which is maybe not how you'd expect that to go. But I think insofar, he mentions at one point being originally from Bratislava, and we don't see anything that contradicts that. Mm-hmm. But he's most identified with growing up in Iowa, isn't he? This is what he's talking about, Taco Tuesday. And I know at one point he refers to her as Margot from Nebraska. So they've both got this Midwest American identity, haven't they? They've got this not coastal US identity, flyover identity, that'll bring me back to Hannibal a bit at the end, I think. They've got a kinship there as well, I think.
Well, and again, it does foreshadow the end because it's and we'll get there when we get there, but it's that quote unquote real America, right? That's the you use the word flyover state, but obviously there's a flip side of that narrative, which is that's the real America, right? And that's
the heartland,
actually
right?
Yeah, but that's often used in very kind of loaded right wing terms, right, to describe this kind of mythical blue collar. America, this is where the real Americans live, is in the middle of the, I mean, they generally tend to be in the South where people still vote Republican, of course, but I love it, and I don't think that's accidental. I also think that there's very strong implications that they're both kind of, they're both from working class backgrounds. That's the other thing that's very clearly implied from that, and that they're, they've risen at this area. And interestingly, when you look at the other guests, it's not immediately apparent to me that any of them are in a similar boat. We don't get the backgrounds, of course, but the food critic, who we haven't really talked about yet, absolutely fantastic character. Oh my god,
beautifully played. I mean, again, one of those characters who, the minute she opens her mouth, in fact, the moment you see her, you know who she is.
The second time I watched this, because I've watched this twice now, I was watching all the characters' reactions, particularly when the outlandish stuff started happening. When the various meals were introduced. But quite late in the movie, in the second half, I was watching her quite a lot. What her reactions to the various meals and announcements was, and they continue to be fascinating.
Well, she's the one who laughs, I think, when the sous chef shoots himself. She's like, it's theatre. It's like
theatre. It's part. Yeah, it's part of.
Like, she is so invested in not being rattled by anything.
I think it might be even slightly later. I think she might laugh when that politician gets his finger cut off.
Yeah, actually, no, she does. She does it. Her first reaction is a laugh. You're absolutely right.
I think after that she knows. Well, shortly after that she knows something's not.
She finally closes in. Yeah. But no, I love that. But I think, like, there's no. I mean, she appears to come from a very solidly at least middle, if not upper middle class background. Obviously, the investors are pretty transparent, kind of Wall Street jock type characters. The movie star's interesting. I mean, he's quite fun because he's quite he's I don't know. He's just a kind of washed up movie star. Yeah, he's wealthy and he's kind of a bit ignorant, but he's not really a bad guy.
He's kind of necessarily. He's not necessarily malevolent, though, is he? I mean, the reason the chef gives for, I love the reason that the chef gives for his presence, actually, which is that you were in a bad film, basically. It kind of
sucks that, actually, for him. Like, really, I'm gonna die because I made a bad movie. Like, come on.
Although, and this is kind of like with the politician as well, I think the film does have quite a traditional morality, shall we say, about infidelity. Because one of the things that the sort of PA of the movie star says is, here's all your stuff back, including the keys to the flat that your wife doesn't know about.
Doesn't know about.
Oh, yes.
That's true. Yeah, that is true.
So it's just throwing in a little bit of seasoning there, ironically, isn't it? You know, this is it's just making him a bit more of a bad guy, right, or a morally ambiguous guy.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think anyone in this movie who's lying to people, anyone who's been shown to be lying to people, is kind of on the.
It's a staunchly moral film in that. In fact, it's slightly Old Testament, isn't it, with regards to morality? You know, if you lie, if you are complicit in infidelity, if you are cruel, you are going to be punished.
Well, what do you think? While we're on that topic, why they're all there? We don't have to go through them one by one, and we've touched on several of them. But I was talking about the PA to the movie star, John Leguizamo's character there. He asks, like right at the end, the chef asks her, he's like, "You went to Brown?" And she's like, "Yes." He's like,
"So good.
Student loans? No." That's why
you're going to die.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I'd forgotten. That's wonderful.
I remember that. I think that line got me the biggest laugh of all of them.
That's one of the funniest lines, I think, but also I think we talked about tone before, Kit, you were talking about it as a sort of 50-50 horror comedy. That's one of the lines where I think, and there are a few moments like this, I might think up some others as we go on, but like I think there's a few where the comedy does threaten a little bit to break the actual sinisterness of it.
Right.
Because that is, I mean, it maybe it's just because with the rest of the chef's actions and justifications, you can kind of build a little bit more grandeur into them. Yeah, and that just comes across as so petty and so, obviously redolent of social class issues and all that, but like, but just the way he expresses it is a bit too pithy.
It's quite glib, isn't it? I mean, it's actually set up like a gag, right? It did the whole delivery and the cadence of it. It's a total gag in the midst of all of the escalating horror and chaos that's happening.
Well, it's also she does actually seem quite nice. There's that as well. So
No, I think
absolutely.
I think that's a good shout. I mean, I think the gag itself is. I think the rationale itself is absolutely in character and in keeping with the chef. But I think you're right. I think it's the delivery that's just slightly off. Because as you said, George, it's glib, and this guy isn't glib.
No,
he's a lot of things. But I
understand why it's written the way it is and why it's structured the way it is, but it maybe breaks the verisimilitude a little bit that he says you are going to die, because that undoes the artistry of it, right? It undoes the slight role-playing element that he's going for. It makes the art very explicit. And that's something he hasn't done and that he doesn't do.
Yeah, it is an interesting decision, isn't it? And I mean, it's a tricky one, really. I mean, at what point did you start to think that was likely to be the end game as a viewer?
What, that everyone there was going to die?
Yeah.
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I found that I was quite shocked by moments in this film because it did things that I didn't expect it to do. I don't even know if I did suspect that they were all going to end up dead in the way that they do.
No, I got ahead of her being an escort. That's one of the main elements I got ahead of, and that's quite rare for me. If I get one thing ahead of time, that's impressive.
But like when it really did start to escalate, I was actually really genuinely shocked.
Right. Oh, that's cool. No, yeah. I mean, that's really good. I just think I think for me, it's an interesting thing. Maybe it's just because it. I mean, not to, this is. We're talking about the film, not about our own work particularly. But of course, one of the things that I found myself thinking was how this had echoes of what goes on in God Bomb in terms of like it's a single setting. It happens in a single location over a very defined period of time. So actually, for me, quite early on, I was looking at this thinking like,
yeah,
I know
this story. This familiar beats going on here. What's going on?
Well, I was thinking because obviously I had the privilege of chatting Banshees of Inisherin with you guys recently, but also there's that recording you guys did. Was it like about a year ago where you talked about Midnight Mass? And I think you could probably do a 3-way Venn diagram just in terms of the chats you guys have had about things happening to people on isolated islands, things being chopped off, things being consumed by fire at the climax.
Yeah.
Actually, there's definitely something going on there.
What's happening? Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned Glass Onion earlier, and obviously that's one of the one of the interesting things structurally about the two movies is they both end with fire. I mean, that's a big like it's the kind of the destruction of the billionaire's kind of fool's paradise is kind of and it's interesting to me because it's one of those things where regardless of whether or not you see it coming on the way through, and there's no reason you should necessarily, when you get to it, it feels completely inevitable. And I think that's
absolutely, yeah.
And that's something I found really interesting because the one genre we haven't really named yet that I think also applies to the movie is parable. And I really do feel like one of the things this film is doing is a parable. And I think what I was so impressed by the time I got to the end was how much it managed to avoid, the degree to which it managed to avoid caricature, given that that's clearly the genre it was working in, and how easily that genre lends itself to caricature. You know, I thought I was just, and that's a combination of the writing and the acting, I think. Given
the ideas that it's playing with and giving the import, I mean, it just avoids becoming didactic, I think. You know, it's really clever in that regard. It does just sidestep that trap, because it could have so easily been too heavy-handed.
Well, look, the difference between this and Glass Onion, I think, and you were talking about this earlier, the reason Glass Onion's a straight-up comedy, but this is a comedy horror, is this is also ruthless about interrogating the relationship, and I would argue, like, the corruption between art and commerce, and how finance inevitably, and how the financial and capitalist impulse inevitably degrades the artistic impulse.
Yeah, totally. And it's explicit in this film as well. This is, you know, I don't think it's possible to watch this film and not come away with that, because it's rendered absolutely. The chef says this to both his audience and to us as the audience, right?
Well, I think if you're to take it semi-literally, because obviously I know parables aren't quite that, but if you're talking about the chef character, there's a point, you know, obviously Margot uncovers various photos of his life, and some of the things he says in the restaurant are at least implied to be true, you know, and how his life's gone, and, you know, on an upward trajectory, as most of us would see it, materially at least, in terms of becoming this high society, very celebrity, presumably pretty rich chef. But there's one bit, I think it's about 2/3 of the way through the film, where he basically says, I think it's during the roast, basically, when he's talking to them all pretty insultingly, he basically says, like, I chose my prices, or like elevated my prices so that I would only get this kind of clientele. I would get you kind of people. So there's the kind of thing of, let's just simplify things and say he's gone mad, right? He's gone, you know, nihilistically mad at society. Did he go mad and then choose to do this up to and including getting this famous and successful? Or did he get this famous and successful and as a result go mad? And I don't think I think that comes close to muddying the waters a little bit. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think it's interesting. Even if you treat it as well, maybe especially if you treat it as a parable, because what are we saying about this guy, you know?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think, I mean, as you were saying that, I think I agree that it's ambiguous, and I think probably deliberately so, because I think there's very little about this film that isn't deliberate. If I have a toe on one side of that, I think it probably is down on the side that he was driven, like that the madness happened on the island. Although, I mean, it was obviously gestating his entire life, actually, because one of the things, I think you talked about the photographs. I mean, one of the brilliant moments for me in the film, and obviously it's not subtle, but I love how when you go through the photos, each more expensive, more, you know, sort of, you know, more prestigious looking restaurant you see, the sadder his face is in the photos. Yeah. And I love that. I mean, again, nothing subtle whatsoever about it, but you see his deterioration, you see his descent into misery. But the reason that I say that I think that the metastasizing of the madness at least happened on the island was because, of course, it's not just his madness. This is absolutely a group psychosis. And that is the bit of it that I find really fascinating. And if I do, I mean, it's not really a complaint, but I note that for me, that's the one side of the story that's just a little bit underdeveloped. And I don't think there was any real way of saying it without breaking format. And I think given that, they made the right decision, because the format is so important.
It has to be a longer movie,
exactly. And that would dilute it ultimately, right?
Of course it would. But I'm fascinated by that, because there's the wonderful moment where, there's the moment where the woman who he confesses to having, you know, sexually exploited or made inappropriate sexual advances, and she stabs him, right? Yeah. And that's part of the men. And then I think it's her later on who giggles and says, "Oh no, it was my idea to have everyone die at the end." It doesn't really make sense.
The food critic is trying to bargain with her and say, right. "Oh, you know, if you let me live, I will."
Right. Yeah. I can
if we do something about this Ephraim dying bit, and she's like, "No, that was my idea."
It's such a great moment.
It's delivered so brilliantly as well. Again, so glibly. And it works in this instance. It really does work, because she is that character, right?
Yeah.
I'm glad you guys brought this up, right? Because I wanted to ask you about this because we've talked about I even know his name, Jeremy Love, the sous chef who shoots himself. We've talked about the female character, who has that speech about unwanted advances and then says the climax was her idea. There's a character I really wanted to ask you guys about, which is Elsa, the maitre d' you were saying, Kit, right? Because you were talking before about things verging on the risk of caricature. She's an actress called Hong Chow. I looked her up now, and she rang a bell when I watched it. And she's been in several things. I think she's in that film, The Whale, that Brendan Fraser just won an award for. But I realised I knew when you realise you know someone from something, but it's probably not a lot of things. It's probably like one or two things. And actually, what it turned out I'd seen her in was the Watchmen series a few years ago. Yeah, she's one of the characters in that. But I was thinking because. I think she's one of the best actors in it. And again, when I was watching it the second time and looking at all the facial expressions and stuff, I was looking at her a lot. But I think that character is also on the brink of caricature. And what I was coming back to, we talked about the island lair feel of it, being Ian Fleming before. I think I was mentioning
the Bond feeling. Yeah,
she's kind of a Rosa Klebb type, isn't she?
She's really interesting. I'm glad you brought her up because she's the center of what I think for me was one of the most kind of ambiguous moments in the film. And that's the moment where, having decided for Margot that she's part of the service team rather than part of the served, Chef sends Margot out to the smokehouse to get a barrel, and he implicates Elsa in that moment. He blames her for the barrel not being there, and later on when they have their confrontation, Elsa is very fucking clear that he'd never asked her to get the barrel. And I still don't understand exactly what's going on in that moment. I don't understand why Chef is giving Margot that task, and why he's implicating Elsa. I don't, and I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, there's a politics involved, isn't there? It almost feels like that he's setting Margot up to take Elsa's place. So that's certainly what Elsa believes.
Is that another bit? I really wasn't thinking this coming into it, and it's just now as we've been talking about it, I was thinking, is that another bit like the point the chef makes in the restaurant? I was saying, the implication in him saying you could have got away as if you'd worked together. That's a part where Elsa and Margot are both out off the radar, out of the room. They could both run to freedom. Obviously, Margot wants freedom. Elsa
does not
consciously want freedom.
Explicitly does not.
But they could both take it. One of them could talk the other into it all round, or they could at least seize control over him or something like that. And they don't, and they kill each other. And is maybe that is this getting a bit into sort of Heath Ledger's Joker again of like he believes the worst of human nature, and in this. And in several occasions, maybe not at the end, but in several occasions he's proved right.
I mean, in that particular room with those particular people, you wouldn't bet against it, would you? Let's be honest.
You absolutely would not. No. They would be pushing that button quite happily, wouldn't they?
Given that he selected the guest list, he has loaded the dice pretty heavily in his favour, I think, at that point.
But I don't know if that bit makes real, to the extent that things in this movie make real psychological sense. If you want it to, I don't know if that does, because if she knows what ending is coming in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Why does she care who's fetching the barrel? I mean, you could say just because she's nuts, like they all by implication must be.
But I mean, her reaction, it looks very much to me like she's kind of like mortally offended.
Yes.
At the implication that she's let Chef down in any way, right? I mean, that's the way I read that moment, because she's the one who meets the guest. She does the tour of the island. She's the one who sets the whole goddamn thing up. And as you said earlier, David, she delivers that amazing line to the, whispers in his ear about like, and it's fucking hell. That's really like that, because that is quite early on. That's a real spine tingler. I think
she's the signifier, isn't she? She's almost like she's the banshee. She's the spectre of things to come.
And again, that's a powerful taboo breaking. The moment where the wait staff talks back, that's the one thing that can't happen. So that is telling you that these, that's the first signifier, really, that this is a very untypical evening. And it's
interesting how upsetting that is to an audience member, isn't it? Because of course we've been conditioned from the moment we were born, really, to understand this power dynamic. The waiter does we ask, right?
I mean, it's interesting to me because of the context, because it's a work of fiction, and because of already the signifiers around the guest. I just found it straight up delightful. I just genuinely, I mean, it was a shiver down the spine, but it was also incredibly pleasurable, because and this movie does that a few times, right? Those moments of kind of, kind of sick wish fulfillment. Do you know what I mean? About
absolutely,
absolutely. Fuck you guys, you are awful. I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I've worked in a bar, but I haven't worked in service. But I've been. Yeah, I think I don't know anyone who hasn't had this experience where you've been in a restaurant and you've seen some people at another table and you've just been like, just shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? Just totally. You are just horrible, especially if they start giving the staff grief. Because my thing is like, anyone who works in the service industry, be nice to them. Yep. And give them a fucking tip, because it's the hardest fucking job on the, like, it's so hard. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, one of my favorite moments in my entire history of ever going to restaurants, I was in Reno and I ordered my food, and the waitress brought the food over and she didn't bring my drink, and I didn't say anything because I'm English. But she just looked at me, looked at the table, looked back at me, and said in this really distracted voice, "Oh shit, I forgot your Sprite." Now I left her a $50 tip because that was a woman
major evening, right?
Was earning her fucking money that night. I knew what was going. So, but you know what I mean? Like, you see someone else on another table and you just think, God, I really wish that waiter could just actually stab that fucking guy. Oh yeah. He's a complete dick, and I love that aspect of this film. So that moment for me as well, it's a taboo breaker and it tells you stuff's happening, but also I can't deny a certain lizard brain thrill.
I think that runs all the way through the film, to be honest. You see, whenever the rich wankers get their fingers cut off or get insulted or get told to sit the fuck down and shut the fuck up, absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
I think there's so much in this film about the desperate need for affirmation, isn't there? We were talking about Tyler before, and that bit with Elsa we were discussing comes just after you've seen Tyler's body hanging, after whatever is whispered to him. So this is, again, you've got this motif of people whispering in people's ears as well. That's interesting. But I was thinking back to the bit where Margot talks to the chef about her sex work, and specifically about why she's been looking over at the politicians' table. And she talks about, well, I mean, they have a really interesting conversation about that. It's very dark, but she's talking about what he's wanted from her, and it's essentially masturbation and gaze holding and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's about being told he's a good man, and then it has an incestuous tone as well, which I think actually, interestingly, I only noticed on the second watch. But when the politician and his wife are talking, and they notice Margot, she makes a reference. She says something like, She reminds me of Claire, isn't she like Claire? And he's like, she's nothing like Claire. And she's like, no, she's got the same mood, the same look as Claire, or something like that. And she's saying it wistfully, but it kind of on my second watch, I think it not only sounds like they might be talking about their daughter, but it sounds like they might even be talking about a deceased daughter.
Their dead daughter,
Yeah, so there are layers there, right?
Maybe. And what I think one of my favourite things about the movie on rewatch is that they don't lay out any of that factually.
No.
But then when you get that little piece of the puzzle, but even subtract all those icky layers and horrible trauma that's implied in all of that, and the sort of the fact that she's saying that's a pretty common one. And the chef is like, that's like a pretty common one. What he wants to be told is he's good, right? What he wants to be told, and he's presumably an elected senator or something with in theory hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, telling him he's good. But he needs that,
But knows innately that he's not. He just knows on some level.
Felt it. It's never felt good. Maybe.
Yeah, right. Yeah, interesting. God, I mean, actually, there's stuff going on in the subtext of the film that's actually much darker than what's explicit, isn't there?
Yeah. But what I love about everything you've just said there is, as much as that, I mean, in that particular case, it's very icky, and it means we don't feel particularly bad about that guy losing a finger. Of course, although the context is different, actually, that's also what's been going on inside Chef for about 20 years at this point.
Yeah.
It's this constant need for affirmation, this need for that approval. And it's gotten to the point where he's elevated his quote unquote art to such a level that only the ultra rich can even afford to partake of it. And it's at that point that he realizes it's all completely fucking hollow.
Yeah, pearls before swine, right? That's what he's come to. It's the fact these people are not worthy. The people who can afford it will never appreciate it. They will never understand what he's doing. They lack the imagination, the empathy and the humanity to understand what he's trying to do. Well, and it's the result is kind of this feedback loop where their apathy and their indifference to everything that isn't their own power and money and aggrandizement has washed back on him and his work, right? It's washed it of joy, as Margot points out to him very, very explicitly and forcibly. What did she say to him? You cook without joy.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of long-running trauma and maybe affirmation or lack of affirmation, I don't think any of us even mentioned the chef's mum's fucking there.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gets Freudian, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, she's
Definitely.
seemingly paralytically drunk, which he even references early on enough so that it could just be seen as a slightly weird, off-color kind of gag by the restaurateurs, by the attendees. I mean, but like, there's something a bit. I managed to go back to Hannibal already, but you know, in the Hannibal movie when Ray Liotta's character's in his last stages there. There's something sort of paralytic in that sense about it, isn't there? It's like it's not clear how much she knows where she is or what's going on, you know.
I mean, it's an interesting, wasn't it? Because he references her alcoholism as being a kind of proximate cause of the abuse, not in the sense of victim blaming straight up, of course, but in the sense of like, there's a strong implication of like, you know, my dad beat us both and mum didn't leave because she was drunk. You know what I mean? There was that sort of there's sort of that vibe to it, isn't there? So, but yeah, I mean, it is one of those moments that I think is almost too much. I actually do think the film gets away with it, but it is one of those where you're just like, oh, that's a bit.
Right.
That's really, really on the fucking nose, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's beautiful. But I think what I love is the weirdness of how it's played kind of makes it work somehow. The actress just sitting there forlornly staring at the space as they endlessly, you know, topping up her wine glass.
Yeah, what a part to play as well. What fun that must have been.
Well, I noticed on rewatch that when just before Tyler makes his disastrous meal, Tyler's bullshit, they're putting him in his like chef whites, and the mother it cuts to the mother, and she just mutters, kind of like half looking at him, "What a handsome boy." which if she was only in it for that moment, that would be worth it enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's funny, Kit, we were joking before about, you know, like Faulty Towers and stuff before the conversation about, you know, that idea of frustration and service and everything like that, you know, and I was joking that, you know, you could do a version, which is funny, we were talking about Fancy London Dining before, you could do a version of this in the same way that they do that immersive Faulty Towers dining experience, you know, like with actors mixed in with paying punters for these actually expensive meals, you know, maybe not quite go the full way and have them engulfed in fire at the end, but you could do something.
Maybe not quite that far, right?
Imply that with lighting, maybe, and then the lights go down. But I mean, she's almost like she's playing the role of the major there, isn't she? She's kind of the older person who's just kind of half present in the situation, almost, you know, lending an air of absurdity to it.
No, I think that's kind of definitely. I think that's. I mean, it is. I find it's fascinating to have her there and have her effectively be a non-speaking character. I mean, you know, obviously she does get a couple of lines, but she's basically kind of not there. She's there as a prop. But then I think that speaks to the whole kind of, you know, as a signifier of the power dynamic at play. It's actually a very strong early signifier of what's going on. You know what I mean? Like that he's prepared to use his own mum as a prop. Because I remember there's the I'm blanking on the name of the character, but the food critic. She even has a line, doesn't she, where she says, you know, because he delivers the speech about the tacos, and if I remember rightly, he goes over to her and he presses his forehead against hers, and she actually says it's so theatrical.
And that's entirely the point, right? I mean, it's like there is like a stage play quality to all of this. On a stage play, the mother's presence would actually make a lot more sense, right? You know, it could be a piece of avant-garde theatre in that regard, which this is, one that's orchestrated by Chef himself.
There are several bits where it would. I've got in my notes the bit about the fallen angel set piece, you know, with the thing outside the window. You can easily imagine that being done in the theatre, but that's kind of looping back to the Freudian stuff because he's got his mum present watching and obviously immolated at the end. But he also sort of symbolically kills his dad there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
He's taking control of the restaurant, and I think he says like, you know, that's I have no owner now. I'm free.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's this whole Freudian thing that's bound up into everything else. This whole situation it's his psyche, right? It is ultimately it's a portrait of everything that's been done to his mind.
It's interesting. One of the few moments as well that gives a nod to the current sort of recent events. Actually, funnily enough, Glass Onion being another film that does it, where they have the throwaway gag where they get injected with something that's like, you don't need to worry about COVID now.
Right.
But the version of that in here, which I think is really interesting, is where he says that he had to cede control of the restaurant to stay alive. I mean, the reason he's drowning that guy is that was his investor, and that guy kept him afloat through COVID.
Yeah.
Which is why he doesn't own his own restaurant anymore. So again, you sort of wonder if part of the triggering mechanism behind this group psychosis, whether or not it's partly, COVID cabin fever that kicked in,
Yeah.
Whether
he mentions that, one of this again, I don't want to keep mentioning Hannibal, but, you get that sort of not elite, but kind of aesthetic sociopathy, I guess, coming through, because at that bit when he's like lowering, the owner into the water, he's basically saying, and he asks for substitutions. Nobody gets to make substitutions. It's not that far away from being able to eat the rude, It's kind of
it's absolutely true.
Yeah,
absolutely true.
yeah,
I think it's almost impossible to not make comparisons to Hannibal, because it's not just the themes, it's the subject matter too. I mean, the way the food is framed in this film and the way it's shot is massively akin to how the food, certainly in the TV series of Hannibal, is shot, right?
No, absolutely. And I mean, one of the fun things for me was as someone who so I've, both my daughter and my missus are kind of big fans of MasterChef. So I've, I half watched quite a lot of MasterChef over the years. I mean, it's actually quite good because I can sit there with a laptop and tap away and just peer over the top every now and then. But one of the things that's interesting, I mean, obviously for most of that show, it's just people trying to cook good. But by the time they get to the end, they do get dropped off in these really high-end kitchens, and they get to work with some really super, 2 and 3, 3-star Michelin chefs in those kind of environments. And when you look at the intricacy of those dishes and the precision and the mania that those chefs bring to it, the source material is there and it's rich. I mean, that's what I thought was really interesting about this, was it didn't, it's only like a half notch up from what is actually out there in terms of the, I mean, there are, because these guys will put these restaurants together, and they'll I mean, I can't remember any of the names or specifics, but I remember one restaurant where it was like everything that is cooked in the restaurant is sourced within 30 miles of the restaurant. That's kind of like the key, and this is absolutely top level cuisine that they're serving in this place, right? This is like, this is, God knows how much they charge per plate, but it's a lot, right? And that's like the mania of that. And I found that aspect of it really interesting, because they keep hinting, don't they, at this kind of ecological thing, right? This kind of, there's a thing about, there's the fisherman who's catching the scallops that you're going to be eating later, and the frozen seawater has come from the sea outside in the ocean. There's a point where the chef, I think at the beginning, actually says you're going to be eating at times entire ecosystems.
Yes, exactly.
It's just like, fucking hell, dude.
Right, right. And I mean, there's a part of me, I think a part of the film too, where it's this ambiguity again about its subject matter, where it is sort of riffing on the absolute absurdity of this culture, but there's also a genuine love, I think, for the artistry too.
Yeah.
And that's where the defeat comes from. It's where the nihilism comes from, because the chef is also, I mean, obviously he is one of these artists. He's one of these people who sees, or at one time in his life, he actually saw the beauty of all of this, but it's been destroyed. Like you said, Kit, it's been destroyed by capitalism.
Yeah, well, I was definitely thinking of, you could talk about horror and comedy and mixtures of the two, but, in the comedy side, I was definitely thinking of the BBC series The Trip, where Rob Brydon and Steve Coogan have those, ridiculous and largely improvised, but and farcical and very petty, conversations. But the restaurant stuff's always so lavishly, lovingly photographed, and the cinematography is just beautiful, and all the meals look incredible. And you could be cynical and say that they had to present the restaurants that way, otherwise they wouldn't get to film there. And there's probably some of that, but the sort of larger fetishization of it, and those characters are comic characters, but they're kind of shown to only appreciated to certain degrees, and they're not the ideal customers, perhaps. I think there's a real tension there. It's not. We were talking before about Margot's disdain for the more ridiculous outre elements of this sort of culture. It's not, as you were saying before, though. She's capable of being impressed by it.
Yeah. Well, I think
absolutely.
For me, what's key about that is the moment Margot puts her foot down and refuses to take part is when she's not served the bread. And the signifier in that, of course, is that Margot is the one person in that restaurant who actually should be allowed to eat the fucking bread, because it's
and that's
poor
why
person's
it doesn't work
food.
if she's there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of it's a really key moment, because I love that. And my favorite moment when they dish up the bread, I mean, well, no, two favorite. We've talked about my favorite moment, which is when the posh guys ask for it and they get told fucking no. That's great. Yeah. But my second favorite moment is the food critic convincing herself that this is brilliant.
Yeah.
I love that. Like, just refusing to accept that this guy has absolutely just slapped her in the face. Like, she can't have that. So instead she's going, well, it's quite outrageous. You know, it's really confrontational.
Well, that's the court jester side of it again.
Quite know how to respond, right?
Yeah. And it's great how out of all of them, Margot's one. And the thing about Margot's response is, it's not the rich douchebags of like, just bring me the fucking bread because I own this place. No. Margot's thing is just like, I'm just not playing.
I am not taking part in this. Yeah, right. I am not a player in this game. Yeah, this culture is beyond me.
Well, it's not even that. I can tell you're taking the piss, and I'm not going to be rude about it, but nor am I going to have the piss taken out of me.
Absolutely.
Again, it's that paradigm break. She shatters the paradigm there, and that's, you know, obviously that'll come back later on. But yeah, I just love I just love that whole thing about like that whole speech he gives about like bread being, and of course then we get, and that's the other genius thing about having the restaurant critic, right? She provides backstory whenever you need it.
Yeah.
And she talks about how, wow, a restaurant that's world famous for its bread and they're not serving us the bread. You know, so you get that little bit of extra information.
Yeah, it's brilliant, right?
It's superb. I mean, that's just elegant writing, I think.
Yeah, again, subtle, right? It doesn't really linger over that moment. It's just that line.
Yeah. George, I know. I think you've seen quite a bit of it, Kit. But George, you're a big Inside Number 9 fan, aren't you?
Oh yeah, I loved it. Love it to bits.
Do you remember I'm going to go on a limb here, and this will be completely wrong. I think it's in season 5 of that, where there's the episode where they're like meant to be at something. I can't remember if it's explicitly the BAFTAs, but they're meant to be at some industry award show, and they have the whole thing. It's the one that Noel Clark's in, funnily enough. It's the one he's like a filmmaker in that. But they have a critic character in that who's like, you know, part of the judging panel, and she's part of the round table, almost like 12 Angry Men style, sort of like deliberations on the qualities of all these actors. But she's shown to be this like really, really tragically sort of almost like girl with her like face pressed against the sweet shop window kind of character who really, really wants to be part of that world, but just kind of acknowledges that she can never, you know, eventually acknowledges she just can't be, and she almost like has a minor breakdown of the episode, like she'll never be actually on set doing the things, you know.
Yeah, I do remember that episode. I find it difficult not to remember all of the episodes of Inside Number 9. It's just beautiful work, you know, utterly beautiful storytelling.
Actually, you can imagine this film as an Inside Number 9.
Totally condensed. Yeah, absolutely you can.
Yeah, I'd like to see both Steve Pemberton and Reece Shearsmith's version of the chef.
What I get the impression,
and I can kind of imagine them.
It'd be a bit more grotesque in some way, wouldn't it? Definitely, without a doubt.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine those happening.
Well, I mean, you know, the moment that I had this really like visceral reaction to the cheeseburger moment in this. Afterwards, I actually wanted one.
Yeah.
Like, I really was salivating for a good cheeseburger after this.
I had one tonight, partly after reading Kit's essay that went up recently about it.
Yeah, I'm kind of low-key obsessed with the cheeseburger in this film. It's funny, you know, I was thinking about that as well. I remember tweeting about this a few months ago before this movie came out, about random bits of food that appear in movies that you find just mind returning to. And I have a few of them. Obviously, there's the Big Kahuna Burger in Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, of course.
You know, because you get that incredible shot of it. Just very briefly when Sam Jackson picks it up in the apartment, and it just looks like the ultimate kind of fast food burger. So there's that one. There's the for some reason the fried egg sandwich that you never even see in the film. I was obsessed with that thing because he doesn't eat it. He just throws it in because obviously it's just a way of someone getting him a note.
Yeah,
I'm just like, what is a delivered fried egg sandwich? What would that?
That's interesting because the internet became obsessed with that fried egg sandwich in was it called Birds of Prey a few years ago as well? Or that Margot Robbie's eating.
That's right. Yeah. But I think you get a bit more detail on that one, don't you? But yeah, that was just I just remember because you never even see it. He literally just throws the greasy paper bag in the bin, and I'm just, why are you doing that? Don't waste a good fried egg sandwich. Probably a good fried egg sandwich.
But it's an interesting subject, isn't it? Food in cinema and in television, actually, because it's notoriously bad, right? It's notoriously difficult to get right, and it's not just like the food itself. It's the etiquette of the food, actually trying to construct a scene around eating and to make it work, whilst also making it feel legitimately like a scene where people are eating, is notoriously really bloody hard.
Well, I don't want to tread on Kit's toes here because I really want him to be able to tell us that, his thoughts on the ending, and then we can react to them. But I did think just to skip slightly ahead, the scene when Anya Taylor-Joy, who's obviously a very beautiful, glamorous lady, eating the cheeseburger. Because they really sort of fetishize that moment quite a bit, and I was like, "This is really doing it for some people." I'm like,
absolutely. Well, yeah, because
this is going to be taken out of context.
I mean, it's a weird thing, but there is this thing certainly in mainstream Hollywood cinema where the beautiful female leads don't eat. They don't do anything visceral because that would diminish that sort of Galadriel pedestal beauty that they have.
I mean, it's an interesting thing because I want to go back to Pulp Fiction because, of course, there is a very famous scene shot in a restaurant in Pulp Fiction where Travolta,
very famous,
sit and eat. But interestingly, in that, I think Uma Thurman takes one bite out of a fucking burger. I think that's the entirety of what happened. And the reason those food scenes are a bitch to shoot is because it's two reasons. One, if you take a bite out of the burger and you have to do 9 takes, you've got to take 9 bites out of the fucking burger and you just had enough of it. But secondly, it's the continuity. You've got to replace that each goddamn time, or you've got to have someone cut the bite out of it that's already been taken out of it. So you take the second one. It's a
nightmare, right?
Nightmare. But interestingly, if you watch that scene of Pulp Fiction, you don't actually, I don't think you see the plates at all. I don't think you even see the burger comes into view briefly and that, but you don't actually see the food for that reason, I think.
I think that's the wiser way of doing it, to be honest.
Well, it helps if both the characters in the scene are very, very high on opiates because they're kind of,
on different opiates as well.
Different opiates, right. But they're appetite suppressants in both cases. So I mean, it's not surprising that they didn't really eat it. But no, in terms of the cheeseburger in this movie, I mean, fucking hell!
There's a lot wrapped up in it as well, isn't there? I mean, first of all, it's the cheeseburger, so it is the symbol of American fast food, right? It's the very symbol of proper hearty working class American fare. But there's also what it means. It's not just what it means in terms of the film; it's what it means to the chef as well, right?
Yeah.
The one moment in the film where he's happy.
Well, this is it, and of course we get the scene earlier with Margot and the photographs, and that's the key to her entire escape is when she finds the photo of him smiling with the burger flipper of the month, or whatever the fuck it is, and just that's the moment when she kind of maybe sees her way through. But so there's both of those things textually, of course, and they're really powerful. Metatextually, though, as well, there's this, for me, the symbol of the burger is this kind of. It's really interesting how it's simultaneously a kind of a symbol of kind of an ultimate personification of capitalist evil in quotes, but the whole thing about the super size me thing and the McDonald's thing and the whole kind of the very real fact that the mass farming of beef is a not inconsiderable factor in where we are in terms of the climate crisis, the ongoing climate crisis, beef being one of the most inefficient ways on the planet of getting energy from the sun into your stomach. It's just an awful, irrespective, not even getting into the any of the kind of arguments around humane treatment of animals, leaving that entirely to one side.
Although as a vegetarian, I'm very happy to hop in whenever you want on that.
Well, you feel free to jump in, if you want to get into that side of it as well. But what I'm saying is, even if you completely leave all of that side of things aside, it's still just on a pure energy efficiency level, it's one of the most inefficient possible ways we could generate. And America in particularly, to a lesser degree, large parts of the Western world in general are absolutely addicted to beef. Yeah. So. And the burger is the personification of that, because as you noted, as the film notes, as it makes explicit, this is poor people's food. Yep. This is if you're poor and you're hungry, about one of the cheapest ways you can get a good old lump of protein in your stomach is to get hold of a cheeseburger.
Yep. Can I just interject briefly there? And it's not veggie propaganda. It's just that I said I'd mention Hannibal one last time, and it really is one last time.
You can mention Hannibal as much as you like.
Fine.
No, I knew you'd say that, George, but that's I'm not mentioning the right Hannibal. That's the problem.
That's the problem, isn't it? Yeah.
I just noted it's in that scene. Ralph Fiennes has that line where she's describing the sort of cheeseburger she wants, and he's kind of bigging up that he can do it, he can provide it. But he actually describes it as the cheeseburger your parents could barely afford, you know.
Yeah.
Like, and that just sounded to me like a very Hannibal Clarice moment, you know, like he means it nicely, I think, in that moment, but he's still emphasizing her poverty, and obviously he's talking a bit about his own past as well.
Yeah,
but he's kind of got this idea. He's almost starting to fetishize the idea of her as this poor little rich girl now, you know, which I just thought interesting.
I mean, it's funny. I'm glad you wrote it down. I actually remembered the line as being the cheap cheeseburger that your parents could barely afford, but I'm sure you're right. But maybe my mind just inserted that because they'd already been talking about it in those terms. But yeah, and it's absolutely riveting moment for me. What I love about that as well, in that moment, I started to feel like maybe the chef was actually rooting for her to get out.
Yeah,
I start to feel like something very funky's happening with the dynamic.
There's an exchange happening there.
Yeah,
it's informed by like her having seen those pictures of him, but it's also informed by an escalating understanding. It is not just a ploy for her to get away.
Yeah,
there's another exchange happening here, which is I see you.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I know you. I get this. I understand what you're going through.
Well, I also think Ralph finds, you know, the way he plays that scene increasingly as they go through what's essentially a confrontation.
Yep.
There's a weird. It should be a confrontation anyway, but he gets this increasingly, almost like slightly cartoonishly broad, beatific smile on his face, like he's a little boy, and like you know, not just a young man, but a little boy. And there's that feeling that she's almost, again, we'll get back to the dominatrix thing and stuff. You know, she's almost seems to have placed him under some form of hypnotic suggestion or something.
Yeah, what she's doing, interestingly, is giving him a return to innocence, which is fascinatingly, it's symbolized by this cheeseburger.
Yeah, and what I love, go on.
No, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, what I love about that is that in turn, actually, I mean, I think the reason he lets her, quote unquote, get away with it is because in that moment, and the reason for that smile is he's realizing that return to innocence actually creates a better story for the menu as a whole than the one he'd originally envisaged. That having this one person leave with that symbol of like his, you know, that one last perfect cheeseburger, which was probably the last time he was happy cooking and the thing maybe he was best at doing, right?
Yeah.
Well, also, who's going to tell anyone about this if not?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was, but we're to believe that was not part of the design, right?
Yeah, exactly. No,
this was just going to happen. This was going to happen, and no one would ever know the details or what went down, or the dialogue, or anything like that.
Yeah, and I do think that's right, and I think that this is the unless you take a super Machiavellian view and you suggest that the moment, because we talked about it earlier and then went on to other things, but the moment that I think is really ambiguous when he sends Margot out for the barrel. I don't know why he does that, and I don't know why he implicates the other staff member in that and why he implicitly blames her. He must know the psychological impact that's going to have. I mean, if you really want to go for like a Master of Puppets vibe, then maybe he was setting them up to confront. He was setting Margot up, knowing that she'd go to his house, crack the code. Maybe that smile is a smile of delight that actually obviously her being there is an accident, but he's found a way to adapt her into the pattern and make an even better story. You could go that way. I prefer it as he just doesn't know what to make of her, and because I lean on the side of just preferring the idea that she gets the agent. You know, she's enough of a badass to figure it out, frankly. Yeah,
absolutely. I like the idea of Margot as a kind of random agent in the play. I think that works much better. And also, did you notice that the moment he decides to let her go is when she starts playing the part? Interestingly.
Yeah. No, that's a really good
She starts using the language of service,
Yeah. Well, also, she goes back into customer mode.
Yeah, right. Can I get it to go? Yeah.
And then it's just but the noises she makes when she bites into that burger, you know, and it is genuine satisfaction, genuine pleasure, genuine. And you know, that's the first time she's done that all evening, right? Everyone else has been all like bragging on about how great this food is, but that's her moment.
Well, I think there's something fetishistic about the way she describes herself as starving as well, because he asks her, you know, how hungry, almost like with this kind of, you know, prompt, the kind of what you'd want from an escort, basically. And she goes for the most extreme version of that answer, and there's some weird, I don't think it's as simple as him lusting after her.
No,
although actually come to think of it, by his own admission of guilt, right, he has been a lustful character.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm not condemning him for that, but I'm just saying that, you know, that there is that bit in it, isn't it, that she might have learned to play into that as well.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, which would make sense given her profession, right?
Right.
Yeah. But in the open, in the sense, given that he knows that's a profession.
Yeah,
yeah, right.
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing about that scene, isn't it? They're both playing on the square in one sense, right? Like, I mean, she's trading on information that, you know, that she's gleaned, but of course he must have worked out that she's worked that out. Yeah. You know, like...
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
As soon as she says she wants a cheeseburger, he knows that she knows.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Started, right? Because he's a private guy.
And it creates intimacy between them, interestingly.
Ah, it's so good. But again, it's that connection that they had at the halfway mark. It's the connection of you know, the difference between them and everyone else in the room is they know poverty. They've come from that background, and they're connecting on that level with, again, poor person's food with the cheeseburger. Yeah. Ah, it's so fucking good, man. It's so
I love the way Margot's character after that point is framed, because you almost get, she's not entirely unhappy with what happened on the island. You know, you almost get the impression like, well, you know what, fuck that.
I tell you what, that very, very final shot where, I mean, and David, you pointed out where she wipes her mouth with the menu. She wipes the ketchup off, but then just before the snap to black, she takes another bite. Man, that is a hungry bite. She takes.
It's not a snap to black; it's a clap. It's another thing that's heralded the artwork, right? So there's the implication that this last thing is also an artwork. You know, this last thing you see, this meal.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Is a dish, is a course. Yeah, oh god, it's so good. But
I also really like the bit when she's just about to leave the restaurant and she's kind of looking around for one last look at the various diners, and they mostly can't meet a gaze, or they're in their own form of terror, or they're looking beseechingly at her. But there's the politician's wife, the one who, you know, we were just surmising may or may not have had this daughter. She gestures for her to go, doesn't she? She looks terrified as well, but she's like, silently, she's like, you go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really little interesting moment of almost, like sisterhood or something. And she's an interesting character because she's one of the few where you feel like, I mean, her culpability really is that she's married to a dick.
Yeah.
You know
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, like, there must be compromises that have happened there that are awful, but they're implied, right? You never get anything really explicitly terrible from her.
And also, she's not super happy about it, right? I mean, there's because obviously one of the things is where the tacos have the picture of him with another woman,
right?
It's very clearly, like, you know, it's very heavily implied it's another escort or it's another kind of fling or whatever, and she's not fucking happy about it, you know. So yeah, but but to come back to the cheeseburger as a symbol, again, what I think is so interesting about it is how, in and of itself, it's like it feels, for me anyway, as a symbol of that. I just love how it's freighted with as much negativity, at least as much negativity as positivity.
Right.
Because although the cheeseburger's like the bottom of the food chain, I can't believe I was about to say that without acknowledging what I was about to say. But if you think about the hierarchy of what we've done here with this restaurant, right? The cheeseburger's at the bottom and, you know, breadless bread is at the top.
Yeah, is at the top, right?
But then you think about, like, in terms of, if you're looking at critiques of capitalism, the hamburger's just as responsible for the collapse as the dish at the top, right? If not more, frankly.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Sheer body weight of them that are being sold right now, and again, the impact that the beef production's having on the environment. So there's a real nihilism baked into that, and it's something. I think the reason it resonated with me so powerfully is because it's something that I find myself thinking about more and more at the moment. Is this push-pull between wanting to engage with the state of the world, wanting to see if there's anything that really. I mean, I don't happen to think there's very little that can be done on an individual basis to try and affect what's going on, but at least try and have the argument with people, at least try and spread consciousness about where we are, and hope that will reach some kind of critical mass, versus a really kind of selfish, but I don't think entirely unreasonable impulse to just say, you really do need to actually fucking enjoy things, because there probably isn't a lot of time left to enjoy them. Now, we're human beings. There never is. Actually, because our lifespans are pretty fucking short, even in the modern era, they're pretty short. So actually, there's a way in which that's an eternal truth anyway, right? That's something that any generation might have had to wrestle with. But is it just me, or for us, is it not have an extra certain level of poignancy because of that background?
Absolutely, yeah. There's almost like an element of, this is something you may not be able to enjoy for much longer, or even like these symbols of innocence may not exist for very much longer, you know.
Well, but your essay on it, Kit, which I think will be probably going on online more broadly, sort of in the future, where is you kind of end almost by suggesting that one route for people today is to, eat the cheeseburger. I think you practically said this, but eat the cheeseburger and also simultaneously rejoice in the billionaires burning.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
A little from column A, a little from column B.
Well, actually, I mean, like this dynamic is something that the film makes explicit when in its final act, in the final course, in the dessert course, right? He says this. He says, like, the s'more. What is it? It is this. Yeah. It is the lowest grade, sort of like most grotesque example of corporatism.
Yeah, I love them being covered in the marshmallow bibs, which look I think they look half like baby bibs, but also probably to British viewers, they look a bit like the Lord's ermine,
Yes, yeah. It was. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant, and yet also it's funny and horrific at the same time. This is where like the horror and the comedy reach their apex. It seems to me. This is where they completely intertwine because you realise what he's going to do, right?
Yeah.
You realise that this, you start to feel it, don't you? I mean, like molten marshmallow on you would be like napalm.
Well, it's like the old I say like with a fondness, the rubber tie around the neck thing, isn't it? It's a comic culinary version of that.
Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, you make the point there, George. But what it means is the design was always to come back to junk food at the end, anyway. But absolutely. What I love is, so maybe part of the reason Margot gets out is because of his delight in her effectively anticipating that. But finding her own spin on it, finding her own way through it. I don't know. I think that maybe that does feed into it as well.
It kind of demonstrates that she understands the sort of the art that he's created here on an intimate level, right? In a way that none of the others really do.
Yeah. It's like she's read enough that she can jump to the end, and because she can jump to the end, for her at least, she can subvert it. She can find a way through. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, and again, I mean, I think we've all talked about this before. David, I know you and I both said how we are both, we're both fairly sort of credulous when it comes to stories. We allow ourselves to just be swept up in them, right? We don't analyze while we're watching. Certainly the first time through, we let ourselves be, and I'm always caught out by twists. And the moment when she said, "Can I make this to go?" I swear to God, I punched the fucking air.
Yeah.
It was such a joyful moment for me.
Yeah. It was brilliant. It's utterly brilliant. It's beautifully played, and it's this very interesting thing where it obviously is a ploy to get away, but it's not just that.
No. Well, she sort of like to take the sex worker thing metaphor further, or feature. She sort of found the safe word in a sense.
Exactly that. Exactly that. She's found that she is the Rosetta Stone all the way through, isn't she? She's the one who actually allows you as the audience to see the sort of hidden language of what's going on in this film. It's utterly brilliant. Utterly brilliant.
And at the same time, she's showing enough respect for what is going on. She's showing enough respect for what she recognizes is Chef's vision and his creativity. That's the flip side of that as well. And again, that feeds into the escort thing of understanding the psychology of the people that you're employed by or that you're working with. But there you go. She's both things at once. She's a customer, but she's also working herself. She's serving and in service. Yeah,
there's a lot going on in this film. More I think than a lot of the sort of popular critical reception has really perceived. There's just so much happening here, and I was very impressed by that.
I think I'm sure we talked about this in Banshees of Inisherin, but I think comedy horror is particularly vulnerable to that kind of critical dismissal.
Yeah. Very much.
And I'm not, in some cases it's justified. Don't get me wrong. I don't think any of us are going to bat for lesbian vampire killers, for example. But all I mean is, I think that it's so. Maybe comedy and horror are so taste dependent, and the mixture of them is even more taste dependent and more subjective. And it just kind of, a lot of critics I admire, respect, love reading their work, that agree with them on not that you have to agree with them on everything, but agree with them on loads of stuff. When it comes to some comedy horrors that I love, I'll find they hate them, and vice versa.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think for me a big part of it is, I mean, both comedy and horror, I think, suffer a little bit as genres from being dismissed as just comedy or just horror anyway. There's an inherent kind of snobbishness about both genres, I would suggest. Like in the aggregate, obviously individual critics can fall in various places, but I think culturally there's that kind of thing. And I think almost like the problem with that is, I think for a lot of people, maybe almost like the first time this movie makes them laugh, they just go, oh, well, it's a comedy then. And they flip into that mode. And again, what I loved about it was just the way it ran both, and it refused to compromise on either. It ran them both in parallel. And I find that, I think for me, part of the reason I find that so admirable is because I think it is very hard to do well.
Yeah.
I actually think I think most comedy horror kind of tends to suck at both, to be perfectly honest.
It's hard to do it on an individual level if you're just doing comedy or if you're just doing horror, to get them to work and to get them to balance and not to contradict one another or undermine one another in some way. And then to entwine them so beautifully at the denouement with the image of the human s'mores.
Well,
utterly brilliant.
For me, that's almost American Werewolf level, and that's high praise.
Yeah, I thought that was genius myself. I thought that was beautiful because it lingers enough, like the way the shots linger on the setup of the human s'mores. It gives you an impression of what's going to happen so that you start to anticipate, you start to imagine yourself in the scenario.
Yeah.
It's really clever. Really damn clever. And I imagine, I can't help but thinking that for American audiences, this will have more impact because, of course, the s'more's not really a British thing, right? It doesn't have the same level of symbolism of sort of childhood and of innocent experience and whatnot that it does in the US.
Although, funnily enough, I think most British audiences will probably plug into the contempt that the chef has for it.
Oh yeah, almost certainly. Yeah.
We tend to maybe not one of our best national characters, but we do tend to sort of have that for American desserts, don't we, and chocolate and things like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually. Very brief sidebar. I know George has seen this movie. I think you've seen this movie, but the self-immolation of the chef at the end sort of gave me a bit of a Saint Maud vibe as well. Talking about vibes to plug into, but from the horror to the comedy, I couldn't forgive myself for not mentioning the bit where it's like right near the climax, the hamburger bit and everything, the cheeseburger bit, where one of the tech bros, the character name's Bryce, I noted, you come back to the restaurant after the sort of fetching the barrel set piece, and they're singing happy birthday to him, and he's like, you told them it was my birthday? And one of the other guys is like, an hour ago it seemed pretty funny. It's funny, like nothing terrible happens to him, but he clearly thinks this is going to be the next meal set piece or something,
Yeah,
but it's just his birthday, and they're just doing that because it's a restaurant.
Yeah. Brilliant.
The only other sequence that we haven't talked about, I do just want to touch on, just because it's so fucking weird, is the scene where, we mentioned it earlier in terms of the fact that the women have a dish to themselves, but it's the fact that the women have a dish to themselves because the men are given an opportunity to escape.
Yeah.
Such a fucking weird,
very interesting, right?
What is that about?
What's
interesting? I hadn't thought about this, but the fact that Margot at the end gets away in the boat, that sort of suggests there was a real opportunity to escape, doesn't it? They're not just toying with him.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I think he was sincere. I think if they had gotten away by whatever means, he would have allowed it.
They're all just so hopeless that there's just no genuine prospect.
This is it. This is exactly it. He's playing on his knowledge of this class, right?
Yeah.
They are inept. When you render them down to survivalist essentials, they've got nothing. They've got nothing because they've never had to do anything. You strip them of their money, you strip them of their status, you strip them of their plays of power, and they've got nothing going on. It was a pretty safe bet that none of them were going to get away.
Yeah. I think the other gag I really love is when he starts to introduce. He says, "You've now got 30 minutes," and I can't remember who it is. It might be Tyler. I can't remember. But one of them immediately starts running.
No, it's not.
No, Tyler lingers. Tyler stays there as though
That's right.
I don't. I'm fine.
Yeah,
and the chef has to go
you too.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. Of course. Yeah. Because Tyler's feels that he's kind of removed from the whole thing somehow. But it's just I just love that, and I love the way he just very politely says, "Oh." Okay.
I one of the bits I also wanted to mention was the bit where the whole set piece where one of the chef's staff, as it turns out, is impersonating like the Coast Guard officer, and they just have that bit where because he's interacting with John Leguizamo's actor character, and they're talking about it, and he's like and he's like playing that he's in awe of him, and he pretends that he's in awe of them because he likes that Calling Dr. Sunshine movie that the chef's already absolutely lambasted. And John Leguizamo has this like wonderful like look at the chef where he's kind of like he's partly hit once again by the fact that that's the movie he's known for, but he also gives the chef a kind of fuck you look. See, someone likes it.
Yeah.
Even in that moment, where he's terrified, it's just great.
Utter brilliance.
What's also lovely about that is it's a double twist of the knife because, of course, in the moment he thinks that's what's going on, but it's all part of an even more elaborate setup by Chef. So, of course, like the real bitterness is, no, of course nobody likes that fucking movie. He was pretending, you arsehole. Like, it's so
nobody
funny,
could possibly like that piece of shit, right?
I gotta say as well, I do love that. I love the pettiness of the reason that guy being there is just because he made a movie that sucked. Because for me, what I like about that is it does show a kind of chink in the armor of shit. I mean, I know like you could argue about whether or not it's too much for laughs, it's too arbitrary, too capricious, but I kind of like that because I think it's something that I can't remember where I read this. Oh, I do. It was David. It was your fault. You sent me this essay about. It was a piece about the writer of Banshees. And there's this wonderful moment in it where because it was quite a snippy review of Banshees and review.
Yeah, it was more critical, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and a review of the guy's work more generally. And I think it was partly about from an Irish perspective, wasn't it? And it was about the kind of the way in which he deploys Irish voices and how the writer felt about that. Obviously, fair game for criticism. I'm not saying that, but what was fascinating there was a bit in there which it's stuck with me really because it's a great bit of writing and one of the most backhanded compliments I've ever read. Where he says he's talking about how the guy who wrote Banshees he tried to get into this particular play group, theatre group at one point, and they rejected his work, and now he's famous. He's refusing to work with them, and he says, and the writer who is describing this sequence said, he said, I actually do think a mark of any truly great artist is an incredible capacity for pettiness, and on that level, this writer clearly has that, which is just brutal kind of backhanded. But I did think like that came back to me forcibly as Chef, as you found out that the reason one of the guests is there is just because he fucking ruined movie night for the chef when he was a kid. And
I like those injections of pettiness and caprice in the character because what they serve to do is exactly what they do for characters like, for example, the Joker. They stop the character from becoming too pure. They stop them from becoming an icon or in some bizarre way, like aspirational. I mean, throughout this thing, the chef presents himself as though he is God, right? He is the God of this world. He's the writer. He's the orchestrator. He is the one who's gathered these people and cast them in the roles that they're going to play to their ultimate ends. The injections of pettiness and caprice humanize him. They make him a bit more flawed.
They do as well. They do, but they also, not to leave Banshees behind yet, they also kind of call to mind Colm a little bit, don't they? Because it's someone who's become obsessed with art and his ideas of art and legacy to the extent of rejecting, well, loads of things, but, life ultimately. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's another thing that this film does really well, which is nihilism. And there is a nihilism just running through all of this. And the funny thing is, I mean, like Margot, I mean, in a more traditional film, Margot would be the one who survives is because she's the one who's holding on to some notion of hope or whatever. And she's not. She's not that person. It's not going to let you get away with that easy answer. There are levels and grades of nihilism happening here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what's key about Margot is that the reason she survives is because she fucking wants to. Yeah, she's. I mean, what's the poetic phrase? Life's longing for itself.
Yeah, right.
That's what Margot kind of symbolizes to me. In that it's someone who just isn't done with being alive yet. Thank you very much.
No, absolutely. I mean, there is a real like carnal quality to Margot in the way she's framed, and I love it to bits. The reason she doesn't like understand this culture, other than the fact that she's just not part of it, is that food is to satisfy desire. That's what it's for. And if it's not doing that, then what the fuck is the point of it? She likes her work at times, or she used to like her work before it was ruined for her. I
think she respects herself, basically.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely.
Which I'm not sure if any of the other characters do anymore.
No, that's right. Yeah, and again, I think that's played out in the breadless bread scene. I think that's that's how that everyone else responds, either by saying trying to pretend it's wonderful or throwing a bratty fit. She's the only one who just calmly says, okay, fine, you're taking the piss. I'm not going to play.
Yeah, it's bullshit. Yeah, it's nonsense.
And I think that's I think that's a really good shout. I think you're right. She's got that self-respect, which even more maybe than even more than Chef does ultimately, I guess.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think
he's kind of clearly got a lot of self-loathing going on.
Oh, absolutely.
He needs other things to respect himself, doesn't he? He needs other props. He needs to stand for more than just what he is, a living person, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, it's one of the reasons why Margot survives, and it's the fact that she is just so ultimately herself, and it's without ambiguity.
Yeah. No, I think, I mean, and just, I mean, all the performances are great, but what a turn! I mean, she is a great actress. I really enjoyed her in Queen's Gambit as well. But I mean, oh God, I'm just, like, I love to. I don't know if you ever do this. I'm such a film nerd. I try and imagine, like, what her face must have been like when she got the script for this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I try and picture it, sit there and be like, oh, I fucking want this.
Yeah, like, to be able to play. I mean, it must be so much fun when you get a role like this, right? When you just connect with it, and you're like, oh my God, I can have such fun with this. Yeah. Oh my God, I can just go to town with this.
Yeah. I'd love to know parallel casting. I don't know if Fiennes was their first choice or whatever. But I would love to know if anyone else was considered as well, and if anyone turned it down.
I'm very glad that it was Fiennes, simply because of the quiescence that he brings to his performances. I think if it was someone who was a little bit more expressive or overt, it wouldn't have worked.
Like Anthony Hopkins, for example.
Oh God, can you imagine? Can you fucking imagine? It would have been a nightmare.
To be fair, I don't think they could have afforded him. B, I suspect he might have thought the game was up. I'm not sure he would have actually wanted to do it.
Well, you see, if they do it as a fancy West End Danny experience, maybe they'll be able to cycle in, former greats of stage and screen.
There you go. Yeah, maybe that'll be. As long as you don't end up with John fucking Cleese, because I think his moment's past.
I tell you who could do it. And again, we're going back to Hannibal here, but Mads has got that quality about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, or let's stick with the Pythons. Michael Palin, go the other way.
Michael Palin. That might actually work. That might work. It's been a while since he had an acting gig, I think, but I could see it.
It's been a long while, hasn't it? Yeah, it's been a long, long while.
But gosh, what a film, huh?
What a film! Yeah, it came a bit out of left field for me. I know that for a fact. It really did just sort of slam out of left field into me, knock me sideways.
The other thing I will say about this one is it's showing early signs of becoming one of those rare movies for me that actually I can see this becoming weirdly a comfort watch for me as well.
Yep, likewise.
I could see this being one of those films that I could stick on a fairly regular basis actually, and just because I know we've talked a lot about individual moments, but I think one of the things I just want to say as we're getting towards wrapping up is just it is structurally exquisite.
The technicals. I mean, like the composition of the film. I mean, like, if you are a fan of movie making, of cinema, of visual media, this is going to be right up your street. There are moments where you're going to be in absolute awe of what they do with like visual storytelling in this film. It's beautiful. Yeah.
And beautiful cinematography. There's some lovely kind of overhead shots of the island that intercut they're traveling through, and then, I mean, the shots of the dish that is the island, right, where they've literally got rocks from the shore and the seaweed and the fucking. Oh God Almighty! It's just it's really, really, really fucking smart. And what I like about it is it's interesting, and I think this is getting to the heart of the ambiguity. We've talked about that thing about art, like. It's clearly, in some ways, poking fun out, or at least interrogating, or mercilessly kind of digging into this kind of ultra high cuisine culture thing, right? It's clearly kind of in some ways quite a negative commentary on that entire kind of art form, whatever you want to call it. But it does also, it felt to me like it does also have, if a certain level of respect for the at least for the work involved, at least for
absolutely. I think that's unambiguous, to be honest. It does. It's a really amazingly complex view that it takes of that entire culture and of the artistry of high-end food.
And I really like that, because I think a lesser filmmaker or maybe a lesser writer, it would have been just a bit too fucking sneery, a bit too aggressively. And this thing could have fallen apart, I think, so easily at so many points.
If it was too didactic, then it wouldn't have worked. It would have come off as too heavy-handed and finger-pointing, you know, it just wouldn't have worked. But it's so light. The touch is so light.
Yeah. And controlled, and you know, as with the metaphor for the entire thing, just it's not a shot wasted. And again, the running time reflects that. It's very, very short. Very
unusual
short
for a film these days, right?
Yeah, it's probably better, as for reasons we discussed before, and those. I think it's probably good it's not longer. You know, I think it's
absolutely.
I don't want any longer would overcomplicate the dialogue, the structure. Everything.
I do not want to see a director's cut of this.
No. I mean, a part of what I loved about it genuinely is not 1 second longer than it needs to be.
Yeah.
And I have so much respect for that, you know, because that it's, again, and I got nothing against long films. I love long movies. I love indulgently long movies. I really do. But
me too. You know, give me, you know, an epic any day of the week.
Yeah.
But
I think The Irishman's a bit short, if anything.
Hey, I actually prefer the director's cut of JFK. Okay, I like three. It's around the 3.5 hour mark that the magic really starts to kick in on that.
It's just going to turn into the Three Yorkshiremen, where we just all try
luxury.
Well, I prefer the Once Upon a Time in America extended edition later.
4-disc edition of Return of the King, or get the fuck out.
Yeah. I'm one of the few people you're likely to meet who's actually sat and watched all of the extended editions back to back as one long film.
That's a long day.
That's a long day.
And you have to get up at 4 a.m. 2 hours before you went to bed.
Yeah. Spoonful of hot gravel.
Is that an amuse bouche? Have we come to a circle?
Yeah, right.
Hot gravel as amuse bouche.
Oh my god! Wow. And on that note, I think we'll call that quits, guys. Is there anything you would like to pimp out before we go?
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Most recent publication, My Life in Horror, Volume 2. So if you've enjoyed hearing me talk and wax lyrical about non-fiction, or rather my reaction to works of fiction, then My Life in Horror Volume 2 is a collection of essays I've recently brought out, paperback, hardback, and ebook edition. So for lots more of me having this kind of discussion, albeit just by myself and in word form, but you know on a variety of pop culture artifacts, you know, with more of a weighting towards the kind of 80s, 90s, 90s kind of era, and covering music as well as cinema and books and so forth. And yeah, My Life in Horror Volume 2 is the one that's out there in a minute. Obviously, if you want to catch hold of most of my non-fiction work is published through Ginger Nuts of Horror. The My Life in Horror series is there and is still running now under George's heading.
Yes.
Catch all the back issues, as it were, there if you want to read the original essays in the original published format. If you want to get hold of my fiction, Kit Power, stick the name in the book section of Amazon. All the ebooks, I think, are Kindle exclusives. But if you do want to get the paperbacks, maybe take the ISBN and go to your bookshop, or indeed go to the publishers, because I've been very lucky to be picked up by some independent publishers, and they should, you know, give me money basically because they need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you want to get something new from me every single week for just $1 a month, patreon.com/kitpower. That's a mixture of essays, non-fiction, audio, and short stories, and indeed excerpts from whatever I'm working on at the moment, novella or novel length stories as well. Including at the moment, as David mentioned earlier, the exclusive early access to the essay I wrote about this movie before we sat down to talk. So again, if you've enjoyed this and you want to get the early access in most cases to my stuff, $1 a month, something new every week, patreon.com/kitpower. That's me.
Excellent. As per usual, guys, links down below. David?
Yeah, so I do a general sort of discussion podcast which roams all over the place and back again, called the EscapeGoat Podcast, which can be found at escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. You can also find us on Twitter at egoat_pod, and find me at d_Faggiani, which I'm presumably spelt below or somewhere in the video as well. And we are also on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. And both these gentlemen have been on the show recently. George, most recently back in November, talking about Count Duckula.
Count Duckula is great fun.
It's pretty great. Let's remain evangelical about that. And
absolutely.
Kit, as of time of recording, just about a month ago, talking about his new essay collection at the time of recording, My Life in Horror Volume 2, which obviously George knows a huge amount about as well.
I know a little bit about it, a little bit.
Increasing amount about that. And I just put out one, again, as of time of recording. The most recent one was a discussion about the two movies, Holiday, which is a Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant movie from 1938, and The Hudsucker Proxy, which is a Coen Brothers movie from the mid-90s. So that was a real fun time with my frequent collaborator, Nanina Gilder, and I'd encourage anyone to check out the back catalogue of those episodes, because I think there's some really good stuff in those.
There is, absolutely. And there's a couple of the episodes floating around on here, I do believe, around the Exaggerated Elegy channel. We've spoken about the video games of the Commodore Amiga.
Oh, yes, that's on there somewhere, yeah.
It's knocking about somewhere. As for myself, guys, as per usual, you can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy, Bloodborne for the 4th time. I know. I hope you guys aren't getting bored of it, because I'm not. I'm absolutely not. So, yeah, could be a full playthrough again. Who knows? More chats like this, of course, and lots of other bits and pieces. New channel based on the My Life in Horror project, which is Our Lives in Horror. We've got quite a few new interviews going up there very, very soon, guys, with various personages, writers, creators from the horror community. As Kit said, I'm now writing articles and essays for the My Life in Horror project. They are published through the Ginger Nuts of Horror. Links below. I think there are 3 essays in the offing at the moment that are about to come out reasonably soon. And you can also find links to all of my published work, my short story collections, etc., over at strangeplaygrounds.com. Guys, thanks so much. I mean, this was one we had to talk about, right?
No, 100%. I mean, as soon as I saw it, I dropped David a note and I was like, "Have you seen the menu yet?" I was like, "Okay, watch it. Watch it. I want to talk. I need." It
has happened quite a lot, hasn't it, lately? There's been some damn good films out recently that have just demanded to be spoken about.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
Absolutely demanded. So, guys, thank you so much. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for listening along with us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Cool.